Nobody stays outside in this storm." That was all he said. One old man, one open door. 17 motorcycles roaring through the worst night Montana had seen in 30 years. The Hells Angels expected another slammed door, another cold rejection. What they got instead would change everything for them, and for the man who had quietly decided that night would be his last. If this story moves you the way it moved us, hit subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in places where something great used to live, not the silence of an empty field or a quiet library. This is different. This is the silence of walls that remember laughter, of floors that carry the ghosts of 10,000 footsteps of air, that still smells faintly of oil and ambition, and years of hard, honest work. That was the silence inside Jack Whitmore's garage on the night of October 14th. Jack was 69 years old, and he was standing in the middle of his shop, the shop he had built with his own 2 hands more than 4 decades ago, holding a ring of keys so familiar that his fingers had shaped grooves into the metal. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was looking at everything. The workbench his father helped him build. The pegboard wall where every tool had its own shadow, its own outline traced in marker, so he always knew when something was missing. The old radio in the corner that had played every station from country to classic rock to the Sunday morning gospel hour without complaint for 31 years. How was memorizing it? The way a man memorizes the face of someone he knows he's about to lose. "All right," he said to nobody. His voice was low and cracked and barely above a whisper. "All right then." He reached up and turned off the main light. The garage went dark, and for the first time in 42 years, Jack Whitmore walked toward the door of his own shop without the intention of coming back in the morning. Let's back up. Because to understand what happened that night, to really understand it the way it needs to be understood, you have to know who Jack Whitmore was. Not what he did, but who he was. Because those are 2 very different things, and for most of his life, even Jack himself had trouble telling them apart. Jack grew up in Harlan County, a small Montana town carved into the side of a mountain range that didn't appear on most maps unless you were specifically looking for it. His father was a machinist. His grandfather before that had worked the mines. The men in Jack's family didn't talk much about what they felt. They showed it in what they built, what they fixed, what they refused to let break. By the time Jack was 12, he could rebuild a carburetor faster than most grown men. By 16, he was the one the local farmers called when their equipment failed during harvest season. Not the mechanic in town, not Jack's father. Jack. There was something about the way Jack listened to engines. He'd lay his hand against a machine and close his eyes, and people who watched him do it always said the same thing afterward. It looked like he was praying, like he was having a private conversation with something that nobody else could hear. His high school shop teacher, a retired Army engineer named Dale Brubaker, pulled Jack aside one afternoon and said words that Jack carried for the rest of his life. "Son," Brubaker said, "I've taught mechanics for 22 years. I know the difference between a boy who's good with machines and a boy who understands them. You understand them. Don't you ever waste that." Jack nodded and said, "Yes, sir." He meant it with everything he had. He opened Whitmore Garage in 1983 when he was 27 years old with a lease he could barely afford a toolbox. He'd spent 3 years collecting piece by piece and a reputation that was already bigger than the building. He didn't advertise. He didn't need to. Word of mouth in a mountain town travels faster than any billboard, and the word on Jack Whitmore was simple and consistent. If he can't fix it, nobody can. The early years were the kind of years that a man looks back on and realizes, usually too late, that he was living his best chapter. The garage stayed open 6 days a week. The lift was always busy. His waiting area, 3 plastic chairs and a coffee maker that hadn't been replaced since Reagan was president, was usually full. Local ranchers, long-haul truckers, weekend riders, the occasional classic car owner who'd driven 2 hours because he'd heard about the old mechanic in the mountains who had the gift. He hired 2 young mechanics in the early 90s, taught them both from scratch, watched them both eventually leave for bigger shops in bigger cities, and felt proud of them even when their absence hurt. He married Dorothy in 1988. She was a school teacher with red hair and a laugh so big it embarrassed her in restaurants. She used to bring him lunch every Tuesday and Thursday, and she'd sit on the stool beside his workbench and read while he worked, not saying anything, just being there, which was the specific kind of company that Jack needed most and appreciated deepest. Dorothy died in 2019. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless, and completely without warning. The way that disease often works on the people who deserve it least. Jack kept the garage open the Monday after her funeral. His sister called him and said, "Jack, you don't have to do that." He said, "I know." He went anyway. Because he didn't know what else to do, and the shop was the only place that still made sense to him. But something changed after Dorothy. Something small and structural, the way a wall can develop a crack that doesn't look like much until it does. The customers started thinning out somewhere around 2020. Part of it was the pandemic, which hit small towns differently than people who didn't live in them, understood not always in deaths, but in the slow closing of things. Businesses that had been fragile for years finally gave way. Supply chains that small shops like Jack's depended on became unpredictable, and then expensive, and then sometimes impossible. And the big chains moved in. That was the part that Jack hadn't prepared for, because he'd spent his whole life believing that craft mattered enough to protect itself. That if you were good enough, if you truly knew what you were doing, people would come. They had always come. But there was a national franchise repair chain that opened a location 40 minutes down the mountain. They had computerized diagnostic systems. They had corporate pricing and loyalty programs, and digital appointment scheduling and loaner vehicles. They had television commercials. Jack had a Radio 3 plastic chairs and 42 years of knowing exactly what was wrong with your engine before you finished describing the problem. It wasn't enough anymore. Not in the marketplace. Not on paper. The bank sent the first letter in January of the year that everything finally collapsed. A polite letter as bank letters go, but precise in its language. The loan against the property was in arrears. There was a window for resolution. The window had a specific closing date. Jack read it twice, set it on the workbench, and went back to the radiator he was flushing. The second letter came in March, less polite. The third letter came in August. It had a date highlighted in yellow. By October, Jack had spoken to a lawyer, reviewed his finances 3 times with 3 different calculators, and arrived at the same number every time. A number that wasn't enough. A number that hadn't been enough for a while, and that he had been quietly refusing to look at directly for longer than he wanted to admit. The property would have to go. The building, the equipment, the lease, the pegboard wall with every tool outlined in marker. All of it. He'd been offered a settlement by the bank, a structured exit that would at least spare him the worst of what foreclosure would do. His lawyer told him to take it. His sister told him to take it. A voice inside him that he recognized as practical and reasonable, and probably right, told him to take it. He kept not taking it. Because here is the thing about a man who has built his whole identity inside 4 walls, the day he locks those walls for the last time, is not just a business decision. It is the end of something he cannot name, but cannot live without. And Jack Whitmore, on the evening of October 14th, had finally run out of reasons to delay. He'd made the calls he needed to make. He'd signed the papers that needed signing, well, almost. There was one form left, something his lawyer needed him to notarize, but that could wait until Monday. Tonight, he just needed to say goodbye. He walked the shop one last time. He ran his hand along the edge of the workbench. He checked the oil levels on the equipment out of pure habit. He straightened a wrench on the pegboard wall that didn't need straightening. He picked up a framed photograph from the shelf beside the old radio. It was a photo of Dorothy sitting on the stool beside his workbench reading her book, completely unaware that he'd taken it. Her red hair was tucked behind one ear. She was smiling at something on the page. He looked at it for a long time. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," he said very quietly to the photograph. "The way you talk to someone when you've long since passed the point of feeling foolish about it. I just don't know." He set the photo down carefully. He turned off the main light. He walked toward the door. And that was the exact moment the storm arrived. The weather system that came off the Rockies that night was the kind that the local meteorologists would spend the following week trying to explain. It was not a planned event. It wasn't even fully tracked until it was already happening. A fast-moving low-pressure system had collided with cold air off the Canadian border and a weather pattern that even experienced forecasters described afterward as unusual. And the result was a storm that came in fast and came in hard. Temperature drops of 30 degrees in under an hour. Ice forming on road surfaces faster than salt trucks could respond. Visibility on the mountain highways dropping to near zero. Montana in October can be violent in ways that people from other places don't fully anticipate. It is a kind of violence that is not dramatic or loud, but simply relentless cold that doesn't perform. It just presses in from every direction and waits for you to stop moving. For a group of motorcyclists caught on those mountain roads, it was not a situation. It was a crisis. Ryan Carter felt the temperature change at about 9 in the evening. He was 47 years old, the chapter president of a Hells Angels MC chapter out of Billings, and a man who had ridden through bad weather enough times that his internal sense of atmospheric danger was calibrated in a way that most people's would never be. He felt the shift in the wind, felt the way the road surface changed under his tires, from something predictable to something that required constant micro-adjustment. And he felt the cold coming not as a discomfort, but as a threat. He keyed his radio. "Brothers, we need to find cover. Now." 16 voices came back to him through the earpiece, spread out over a quarter-mile of mountain highway. Some acknowledged immediately. Some took an extra second, which told him they were already feeling it too. They were a group of 17 riders returning from a regional gathering 3 states over. Not a criminal convoy. Not what the word Hells Angels often makes people picture when they don't know better. They were mechanics and veterans and tradesmen and fathers, men in their 40s and 50s and 60s, bound together by the specific and genuine brotherhood that long-distance riding creates in people who've done it long enough. Among them was Walt Hayes. Walt was 63 years old, the oldest rider in the group, and he had been riding since he was 15. He knew motorcycles the way Jack Whitmore knew engines, intuitively, deeply, with the kind of knowledge that comes from 4 decades of daily contact. But Walt had also been managing a heart condition for the last 2 years that he discussed with very few people, because Walt Hayes was not the kind of man who volunteered his vulnerabilities. Ryan knew. That was it. Just Ryan. And Ryan had been watching Walt's bike in his mirrors since the temperature started dropping, because when Walt got cold, really cold, the physical stress of it reached beyond discomfort and into territory that Ryan didn't like to think about. "Walt," Ryan said it on a private channel. "How are you doing?" A pause. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Longer this time. "I'm managing." Ryan understood what that meant. He pressed harder on the throttle. The problem was the bikes. The storm hadn't just brought cold, it had brought moisture, and the moisture had been finding its way into electrical systems, into fuel lines, into the dozens of small and sensitive mechanical joints that make a motorcycle go. One by one, over the course of about 40 minutes. On those mountain roads, the group's bikes began to behave in ways that were not good. 2 of them had electrical failures. Dashboard lights flickering out, the electronics cutting in and out, in patterns that suggested water ingress in places it should never reach. One man's fuel system started surging, the engine revving and dropping in a rhythm that made the rider fight the handlebars every 30 seconds. Another bike developed a brake pull so severe that the rider dropped back to the end of the group rather than risk it near other riders. They stopped at a gas station. Closed. They found a service station 2 miles down. Closed, lights off, nobody home. A truck stop a mile further had fuel, but no repair bay, and a clerk who looked at 17 leather-jacketed riders and suggested politely but unmistakably that they keep moving. Ryan got back on the bike and looked at his group. 17 men wet through bikes, failing temperature, still dropping highway, still dark. "There's a garage," said Marcus Webb. Ryan's road captain pulling up a navigation screen on his phone with shaking fingers. 3 miles up, Whitmore Garage. It's listed, but... He squinted at the screen. No hours showing, no reviews in the last 2 years. Is there anything else? Marcus looked, scrolled. Not within 20 miles that's rated as open. Ryan nodded once. We go there. They arrived at Whitmore Garage at 11 minutes past 10 on the evening of October 14th. What they saw was a building that appeared from the road to be closed. The front lights were off. The sign above the bay doors, Whitmore Garage Est, 1983, hand-painted in the kind of lettering that a man does himself because he wants it to be his, was dark. But there was a light, not a shop light or a sign. Just the faint glow from a window on the side of the building, a back room, or a storage area. The kind of light that suggests not open, but not fully gone either. Ryan pulled his bike up in front of the bay doors. The others arranged themselves behind him, engines idling, the sound filling the empty parking lot in a way that was impossible to ignore. He climbed off the bike. His legs were stiff, and his hands were so cold that the simple act of removing his helmet required more concentration than it should have. He walked to the side door of the garage, not the big roll-up bay doors, but the regular entrance, and knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. Behind him, Marcus was helping Walt off his bike. Walt had both hands gripping Marcus's arm in a way that he would not normally permit, which told Ryan more than any words would have. Ryan turned back to the door and knocked a third time with the flat of his hand, the knock of a man with no more patience for courtesy. The light inside shifted. Footsteps. The deadbolt turned. The door opened 4 inches, held by a security chain, and a face appeared in the gap. White-haired, weathered, the face of a man who had been interrupted from something private and was not immediately predisposed toward generosity. Jack Whitmore looked at the man on his doorstep. Then he looked past him at the parking lot full of motorcycles and riders, and at the storm that was even now putting ice on the windshields of every vehicle in sight. Ryan Carter, who had prepared himself for rejection because that was what he had received at every other stop that night, looked the old man in the eye and said, "Sir, I'm sorry for the hour. Our bikes are failing, and we've got a man in the group who needs to get out of the cold. We've tried everywhere else. I know what we look like. I'm asking anyway." A long silence. Jack Whitmore looked at the man in front of him, looked at the parking lot behind him, looked at Walt Hayes, who was standing at the edge of the group with Marcus's hand on his arm and a grayness to his face that cut through the dim light in a way that landed squarely in the part of Jack that had never, not once in 69 years, been able to walk past someone who needed help. He reached up and unlatched the security chain. The door swung wide. "Bring them inside," he said. "Nobody stays outside in this storm." Ryan stared. For a fraction of a second, a beat so small that most people wouldn't have caught it. Ryan Carter, a man who had been riding with the Hells Angels for 23 years, and who had walked into more difficult situations than most people encounter in a lifetime, just stared. He hadn't expected that. He'd braced for argument. He'd prepared a second appeal, a longer one, more detailed, the kind that laid out the logistics and the safety issues and made it harder to say no. He'd even in the back of his mind started calculating which direction they'd head, if this was another rejection, which way offered the most shelter, with the least road between here and there. He hadn't prepared for an open door. "Move," he said to himself, and then to his group. "Everyone inside, let's go." What followed was the kind of organized chaos that only happens with a group of experienced people who are all tired and relieved at the same time. Bikes were pushed inside the bay doors, which Jack opened from a control panel near the workbench. Men filed in, pulling off helmets and wet jackets, stomping boots on the concrete floor, breathing hard from the cold and the tension of the ride. Jack was already moving. He didn't stop to introduce himself or explain his situation or ask for names. He saw the condition of the group, saw Walt Hayes in particular, and he started making decisions in the rapid, quiet way of a man who has spent his whole adult life solving problems under pressure. "You," he said, pointing to Marcus. "Get your friend over here, side office. There's a space heater in there. Get him sitting down." Marcus didn't argue. He put his arm around Walt and walked him toward the office. "The rest of you," Jack said, raising his voice to reach the whole group. "There's a chest against the back wall. Top shelf has road flares and hand warmers. They're old, but they're good. Second shelf has a first aid kit and some blankets. Take what you need." "We don't want to take your—" I said, "Take what you need." Jack's voice was not harsh. It was simply the voice of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in discussion about it. There's a coffee maker on the bench. It's not fancy, but it's hot. Help yourselves. He turned before anyone could respond and walked toward the office where Marcus had taken Walt. The office was small and cluttered with the paper accumulation of 40 years of a one-man business. File cabinets. A desk buried under invoices and parts catalogs. A small couch that had been there so long, it had conformed to the shape of every person who'd ever sat on it. The space heater in the corner was already running ticking as it warmed up. Walt was sitting on the couch, jacket off, hands in his lap. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and gray-bearded, and the smallness that the cold had put into him was visible in the set of his shoulders and the pallor of his face. Jack crouched down in front of him. "What's your name?" "Walt." "Walt, my name is Jack. I'm going to check a few things, all right? Don't let that bother you." Walt looked at him with the assessment that old men give each other. Sizing up not competence, but character. "You a doctor?" "No," Jack said. "But I've got first aid training from 30 years ago, and I've had a few situations in this shop that required it." He was already checking Walt's pulse the way he'd been taught, 2 fingers light pressure, counting silently. "Any heart trouble? And I'm asking because I need to know, not because I'm writing a report." A beat. Walt glanced toward the door where Marcus was standing watch, then back to Jack. "Yeah." "Medication?" "In my saddlebag." Jack looked up at Marcus. Marcus was already moving. He turned back to Walt. "How long were you on that road in that condition?" "About an hour and a half." Jack nodded. Didn't show what he thought about that. "Your pulse is slow, but it's steady. That's good. What I need you to do is stay still and let the room warm you up. Don't rush it. The heater's going to feel too good too fast. That's the risk, your body wanting to compensate too quickly. Let it be gradual." Walt looked at him. "You've done this before." "Once," Jack said. 1996. Young Ryder broke down outside in January. By the time he got to my door, he was in worse shape than you. He was fine." A small pause. "Mostly because he stopped arguing with me." Despite everything, Walt laughed. It was a short sound, more air than voice, but it was real. "All right," Walt said. Marcus returned with Walt's medication. Jack watched Walt take it, checked the label without comment, and then stood. "I'm going to look at your bikes," he said. "You're going to stay here and drink whatever's hot in that cup and not move until the color comes back to your face." "Understood." "You're bossy for a man running a closed shop," Walt said. Jack looked at him. Something passed across his face, a flicker of something too complex to name, something that had to do with the fact that yes, it was a closed shop, that he had turned off the lights 20 minutes before this group had arrived, that the ring of keys in his pocket included the key to the lockbox where he'd put the papers his lawyer needed him to sign. "Yeah," Jack said quietly. "Well, tonight it's open." He walked back into the main bay. The scene that met him had transformed. The riders had organized themselves. Wet gear hung over the equipment racks. Men stood in loose clusters with cups of coffee and activated hand warmers helmets lined up against the wall with the orderliness of men who are used to shared spaces and unspoken protocols. The bikes were arranged in 2 rows, the failing ones pulled to the front. Ryan Carter was standing in the center of the bay, up close. Ryan was the kind of man that you understood immediately and had to revise slowly. The first impression was pure authority. The straight spine, the deliberate stillness, the way his eyes moved around a room and recorded it without appearing to. The revision came when you noticed the other things, the way he'd held the door for the older riders coming in, the quiet check-ins he'd been making around the room, the fact that he was the last one to pour himself coffee. He watched Jack walk toward the bikes. "How's Walt?" Ryan asked. "He'll be okay," Jack said. "He needs warmth and rest, and to stop being stubborn about asking for help, but that last part's not something I can fix." He stopped in front of the first bike, the one with the worst electrical symptoms. "Tell me what each of them is doing. In plain terms, not mechanic terms. What does it feel like to ride them?" Ryan blinked. That's an unusual way to diagnose. I know how I diagnose, Jack said, not unkindly. Tell me what they feel like. Ryan looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded, and he began to describe each bike's symptoms in the plain language of a man who rides, but doesn't build the way. The lights flickered in a pattern that seemed to respond to throttle input, the way the fuel surge happened at a specific RPM, the way the brake pull was subtle at low speed and terrifying at high speed. Jack listened without taking his hands out of his pockets. He didn't write anything down. He didn't reach for any tools. He just listened. And his face, in the way that an experienced reader's face responds to a well-told story, responded to what he was hearing with a series of small, quiet reactions, a slight narrowing of the eyes. Here, a fractional nod there, that told anyone paying attention that he was not just hearing, but translating. Mapping the symptoms onto his knowledge, the way a doctor maps reported pain onto anatomy. All right, he said when Ryan finished. The electrical issues are water in the relay boxes. Both bikes have the same access point on that model, same weakness in the seal. I can address that. The fuel surge is a clogged injector, probably debris that the storm kicked into the line. That'll take about 40 minutes. The brake pull. He paused. Which side? Left. Caliper. Probably a stuck piston. Happens on wet rides if the caliper's been running dry. He finally took his hands out of his pockets. None of these will strand you permanently, but all of them will get someone hurt or killed on these roads tonight. Ryan was quiet for a moment. You already knew this before I finished describing them, he said. It wasn't a question. Jack picked up a flashlight from the workbench and crouched beside the first bike. I had a pretty good idea after the second one, yeah? How? Jack looked up at him. The flashlight threw shadows across the garage floor, and in that light, Jack Whitmore looked his age, and then simultaneously, nothing like it. Because I've been listening to engines for 42 years, he said, and engines all have the same voice when they're hurting. You just have to learn how to hear it. He turned back to the bike. He began to work. What happened in the next 6 hours was something that none of the 17 men who witnessed it would describe the same way afterward, but that all of them would describe as remarkable. Not because it was fast, not because it was flashy, not because Jack had equipment that they hadn't seen before or used techniques that were exotic or unfamiliar. It was remarkable because of the quality of the attention. In a world where most professional service operates on time efficiency, where the goal is to process the task and move to the next one. What Jack Whitmore brought to those bikes in the small hours of October 15th was something different. He brought the full weight of his focus. He brought the kind of slow, deliberate precision that comes from a man who has never, not once in his career, done something by half. He started with the electrical relays. He explained to the writer, a man named Craig, who turned out to have some mechanical background himself, exactly what he was doing and why, and Craig relayed the information to the others in the group who were watching. Not because Jack needed an audience, but because he had always believed that knowledge was something you passed forward, and these men were clearly going to be back on motorcycles, and the more they understood about their machines, the safer they'd be. He moved to the fuel injector. He didn't have the specific cleaning solvent he would have preferred. His supply chain had been unpredictable for months, and he hadn't restocked several things he'd been meaning to, but he had alternatives, and the alternatives he chose were the ones that a man who truly understands chemistry, as well as mechanics, chooses, not the ones that solve the immediate problem and create a different one later. He got to the brakes at 2 in the morning. By that point, the garage had shifted. The energy in the room had changed in the specific way that it changes when people who don't know each other have been in the same space for long enough, working toward the same thing, sharing the same bad coffee, sitting with the same cold and the same relief at being out of it. Conversations had started. Not the polite, cautious conversations of strangers, but the real kind. The kind that starts when people stop performing for each other and just start talking. Marcus was sitting on an overturned crate near Walt's office door, listening to Walt describe a ride he'd done in 1991 through the Cascades in conditions that made tonight sound mild. A man named Derek, who turned out to be a retired veteran from Billings, was showing 2 younger riders how to properly treat a cold weather hand injury. not because anyone had asked him to, but because the information was relevant and useful, and he had it. Ryan was standing at the edge of the workbench, watching Jack work on the brake caliper with a focus that had moved past observation and into something closer to study. "How long have you been doing this?" Ryan asked. "Since I was 12, Jack said without looking up. "This shop, 42 years. Ryan was quiet for a moment. "It looks like you were closing up when we got here." Jack's hands didn't stop moving. "Does it?" The lights were off. The sign was dark. Storm knocked some things out. Ryan let that sit for a moment. He was a perceptive man, and he knew he was being given an exit if he wanted one. He chose not to take it. "You don't have to tell me," he said. I see this shop, and I see the work you do, and it doesn't—" He paused, choosing words. "It doesn't look like a place that should be closing." Jack set down the tool he was holding. He picked up a rag and cleaned his hands with the slow deliberateness of a man deciding whether or not to answer a question honestly. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't." He picked up the tool again. "But the world doesn't always care what something looks like," he said. "It cares what it produces on a balance sheet. And those are two different languages, and I only ever learned one of them." Ryan didn't say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say, and Ryan Carter was not a man who spoke when he had nothing useful to say. But something shifted in his expression, something that Jack focused on the brake caliper didn't see. Ryan saw it clearly, though. He saw a man who was extraordinary at what he did, sitting inside what he'd built at the end of a road. He hadn't chosen doing the thing he was best at for people who needed him. He'd seen that picture before. He'd just never seen it quite so clearly. He filed it away. At 2:47 in the morning, Jack stood up from the last bike, pressed both hands against the small of his back, and straightened slowly. "That's all of them," he said. The garage went quiet. It wasn't a dramatic quiet. It was the quiet of a room full of people who have just watched something finish, who are all registering the same thing at the same time. Ryan walked over and looked at the bike, the brake caliper bike, the last one, and crouched down where Jack had been working. "Test it," Jack said. Ryan reached down and manually checked the pressure on the lever. Then he stood and looked at Jack. "It's right," he said. "I know it is," Jack said. "Not arrogance, just fact. How much do we owe you?" Jack shook his head. "Nothing." Ryan frowned. "Sir." I said nothing. Jack set the rag down on the workbench. "You were in the storm. You needed help. That's the beginning and end of it. That's 4 hours of work," Ryan said. "Minimum. On bikes you'd never seen before in the middle of the night when your shop was—" He stopped himself. Jack looked at him. Ryan said it anyway. "When your shop was closing." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight in it. Jack held Ryan's gaze for a moment. Then he looked away, not down, not furtively, but the way a man looks away when he's deciding how much truth to let into the room. "Yeah," he said. "Well?" He picked up the rag again, though his hands were already clean. "Like I said, tonight it was open." He walked to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup that was 3 hours old and still the best thing he'd had all night. Across the garage, the riders were beginning to stir, talking about the time, about the roads, about when it would be safe to ride again. Someone checked weather on his phone and reported that the storm had broken, that the highway crews had been working the roads, that by 4 or 5, the mountain passes should be manageable. Walt emerged from the office. He walked slowly, and he held his left hand against the doorframe as he came through just briefly, the kind of gesture that a man makes when he's steadier than he was, but not quite ready to advertise it. And then he let go, and straightened, and walked into the main bay, like a man who had simply been resting, which was technically true. He looked at Jack. Jack looked at him. "Better," Jack said. "Better," Walt said. "Good." Walt walked over and stood beside him. They were roughly the same age, these two men, though they had arrived at their 60s from very different directions and worn them in very different ways. They stood together at the workbench and drank 3-hour-old coffee and didn't say anything for a while, which was the kind of companionship that old men who've been through things sometimes find at strange hours in unexpected places. "You saved us tonight," Walt said finally. Jack looked at his coffee cup. "I just opened the door." "Yeah," Walt said. "That's what I mean." Ryan, meanwhile, was doing what he always did in a new place, looking at it carefully. He'd moved around this garage during the night, not aimlessly, but in the slow observational circuit of a man who processes information visually and has learned to trust what a space tells him about the person who built it. He'd looked at the tool organization, the cleanliness of the equipment, the years of accumulated repair orders pinned to the corkboard, the small handwritten notes Jack had posted to himself in various places. Not reminders but notations. The kind of thing a master craftsman writes down. Not because he'll forget, but because he's the kind of person who takes his own work seriously enough to document it. He'd looked at the photographs on the wall. There were dozens of them. They covered the back wall in a loose collage that had clearly grown organically over decades. New photos added as they arrived. No organized layout, just the accumulation of years and memory. Bikes Jack had worked on. Customers shaking his hand. A few newspaper clippings yellowed with age about various repair projects that had apparently been worth writing about. A photo of a young Jack barely recognizable as the same person, and immediately recognizable as the same person standing in front of the garage in 1983, with his hand against the wall and a look of fierce, quiet pride on his face. Ryan had looked at all of this. And then, in the third hour of the night, at a moment when most of the other riders were either asleep on their jackets or deep in conversation, Ryan had stopped. He'd stopped in front of one particular photograph. It wasn't the most prominent thing on the wall. It was off to the left, slightly higher than eye level, the kind of position that suggests it was put there, not for display, but for proximity, because the person who hung it wanted it near, not because they were showing it off. It was an engine design. A photograph of a custom engine design, detailed and distinctive, with handwritten notation in the margins. Ryan stood and looked at it for a long time. His brain, which cataloged motorcycle-related information, the way certain people's brains catalog music or faces or statistics, was doing something very specific. It was matching. It was pulling from a database of knowledge assembled over 23 years of writing and talking and listening to the community that he had devoted a significant portion of his life to. He knew this design, not the specific photograph, the design. He'd seen it referenced. He'd seen it discussed. He'd sat in garages from Montana to Arizona and listened to builders, serious builders, the kind who understood engines, the way Jack understood engines, talk about a custom design that had appeared in the early 90s and influenced an entire generation of custom motorcycle work. A design so clean, so mechanically elegant, so far ahead of its moment, that people who encountered it later sometimes assumed it had come from a European manufacturer or a major racing program. It hadn't. It had come from a mountain town in Montana, from a one-man garage, from a mechanic whose name nobody in those conversations had ever been able to confirm because the design had spread the way. Good ideas spread before the internet, person to person, adaptation to adaptation, losing its attribution at each step until the origin was more legend than fact. Ryan looked at the photograph. He looked at the notation in the margin. He looked at the handwriting. He had seen that handwriting all night on the notes posted around the garage on the repair orders on the corkboard. He turned very slowly and looked across the garage at Jack Whitmore, who was standing at the workbench drinking 3-hour-old coffee and talking quietly with Walt. "Hey," Ryan said. His voice came out different than he intended. Quieter. The way your voice gets when you are processing something that is larger than your normal conversational register. Jack looked over. "That photograph," Ryan said. He pointed. "On the wall, left side higher up, the engine design." Jack looked at it. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A very slight closing. The way a face closes when a topic arrives that it hadn't expected and doesn't quite know what to do with. "What about it?" Jack said. Not a question. A door held slightly open. Ryan walked across the garage. The other conversations quieted, not because anyone called for quiet, but because the change in Ryan's manner was the kind of thing that a room of perceptive people notices without deciding to. Ryan stopped in front of the photograph. He looked at it for another moment. Then he turned to face Jack. "You built this," Ryan said. It was not a question either. Jack said nothing. "I've been in this community my whole adult life," Ryan said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. A quality of controlled astonishment, the kind that happens when the mind has arrived at a conclusion before the emotions have caught up to what that conclusion means. "I've sat in garages from here to the Gulf Coast and listened to builders talk about a design that came out of Montana in the 90s. Nobody knew who made it. There were theories. Some people said it was a shop in Missoula. Some said it was a private builder who'd worked for one of the European marquees and come back. The design became kind of a ghost story in the custom community. Something that people built off of without knowing where it came from." I was looking straight at Jack. "You're him," Ryan said. "You're the mechanic." Jack Whitmore looked at the photograph on his wall. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's seen so many times that it's become wallpaper, present familiar, but no longer fully visible. Then he looked back at Ryan. And something in his face that had been closed for a very long time opened just slightly, like a door that hasn't been used in years, giving way to a careful hand. "I didn't know anyone remembered it," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Ryan looked at him. "Remembered it." He shook his head slowly. "Sir, that design is referenced in custom engine builds from here to Florida. It influenced at least a dozen builders that I know personally. There are—" He stopped, collected himself. "There are guys in my community who've been riding on derivatives of that engine for 20 years who would not believe where I'm standing right now." Jack said nothing. He was looking at the photograph again. 40 years of believing his best work had gone nowhere. 40 years of building and repairing and creating inside four walls that the world had decided eventually it no longer needed. 40 years of being the legendary mechanic of a town that nobody drove to anymore. Of being the master craftsman in the age of the diagnostic computer, of watching the thing he'd built himself be measured against standards he hadn't designed for and found insufficient. 40 years of believing that what he'd made had disappeared. And now, in the middle of the worst night he'd had in a long time, on a night when he had turned the lights off and said goodbye to the place that had been his whole life. 17 strangers had walked in from the storm. One of them knew his name. Not his actual name. The name that mattered. The name attached to the thing he had been most proud of in his life. Ryan watched the old mechanic standing in the middle of his own garage, looking at a photograph on his own wall in the early hours of the morning, of the day he'd decided would be his last day here. He watched something move across Jack Whitmore's face that Ryan Carter, who was not a sentimental man, had to look away from. Not because it was too much, because it was private. Because some things a man should be allowed to feel inside himself without witnesses, even when the witnesses are people who are glad to be there. Ryan turned and walked back to the other side of the garage. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at Marcus, who had been watching. Marcus raised his eyebrows. "What was that?" Ryan shook his head. He looked at the photograph one more time from across the room. Then he looked at the ring of keys sitting on the edge of the workbench where Jack had set them down when he'd started working. A ring of keys that a man had been carrying toward a locked door on the last night of something. Ryan looked at those keys for a long moment, and he began to think. At 4:30 in the morning, the first bike rolled out of Whitmore Garage under its own power. Then the second. Then, one by one, the rest. The storm had broken. The highway was clear enough. The temperature was still punishing, but the ice was off the surfaces and the visibility had come back, which meant the road was rideable for men who knew how to read it. Walt was the last one out. He stopped at the door, looked back at Jack, and shook his hand, with both of his, the grip of a man who means it and knows the other man will understand. "Thank you," he said. Simple, true. "Take care of yourself," Jack said, "and stop hiding your condition from people who'd want to know." Walt almost smiled. "I'll take that under advisement." "That's what they all say." Walt went out the door. Ryan was last. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and he and Jack looked at each other across the threshold. The old mechanic and the road captain, the man who had opened the door and the man who had come through it. "You're going to be all right," Ryan said. Jack looked at him. Not quite a question, not quite an agreement. "Those keys," Ryan said, nodding toward the workbench. "Leave them where they are tonight." Then he went out the door, and the sound of 17 motorcycle engines rose into the cold morning air and grew smaller, and then was gone. Jack stood in the open doorway of the garage for a long moment. The parking lot was empty. The storm was over. The sky to the east had the particular deep blue that precedes dawn, the color the world turns in the hour before it decides to try again. He looked at the ring of keys on the workbench. He looked at the photograph on the wall. He looked at the coffee maker which had brewed 6 pots through the night and was currently incredibly still functioning. He walked back inside. He closed the door. He did not lock it. He sat down on the stool beside the workbench, Dorothy's stool, and put his hands flat on the surface in front of him and just breathed. And he thought my work had never been forgotten. He thought about that. I thought about what it meant and what it had cost him not to know it and what the knowing changed. Outside the sky kept turning lighter. The day was coming the way days always came, indifferent to what had happened in the night. But inside Whitmore Garage, inside the walls that remembered everything, inside the shop that had been built by a man who understood machines and quiet, and what it means to do something so well that it outlives your awareness of it. A light was on, the same light that had been on when 17 riders came up the mountain road. Still burning. The stool was Dorothy's stool. Jack had never moved it. After she died, he'd thought about it, thought about how it might be easier not to see it every day, sitting there empty beside the workbench where she used to read while he worked. He'd thought about moving it to the storage room, or loaning it to somebody, or finding any of a dozen small excuses to make it disappear from his peripheral vision so he could stop noticing the absence it represented. He never did. He sat on it now in the hour before dawn, with his hands flat on the workbench and the last of the coffee going cold in the pot. And he listened to the garage settle around him, the way old buildings settle creaks and ticks, and the small percussion of a structure that has been through something and is returning to itself. The smell of motorcycle exhaust still hung in the air. Oil and cold weather and 17 men and the particular chemistry of a long night's work. Jack breathed it in and didn't find it unpleasant. He found it actually the most alive the garage had smelled in months. He didn't sleep. He sat and he thought, and the sky outside went from deep blue to gray to the first pale suggestions of something warmer, and Jack Whitmore did not move from Dorothy's stool, except once to pour himself the last of the cold coffee which he drank without bothering to heat it. He was thinking about what Ryan Carter had said. Not the words themselves, he'd understood the words fine in the moment. He was thinking about what they meant underneath. About the specific quality of information that arrives too late to change the decisions you made without it, but not too late to change everything that comes after. His design had not disappeared. 40 years of believing a thing, and the thing turned out not to be true. He pressed his hands harder against the workbench surface. The wood was worn smooth in the places where his hands always went, shaped by decades of exactly this posture. Jack Whitmore thinking with his palms flat and his weight forward, and whatever problem he was solving, arranged somewhere in the middle distance in front of him. The ring of keys was still on the workbench where he'd set them down when he started working the night before. He looked at them. He thought about Ryan's last words at the door. Leave them where they are tonight. He hadn't moved them. I didn't know yet what that meant. He didn't know if it meant anything beyond a tired man's decision to defer a painful thing by a few hours. But the keys were there, and he was here, and the light was still on, and something about the combination of those facts felt not resolved, not fixed, but different than it had felt at 10:15 the previous evening when he'd first reached up to turn that light off. At 6:20 in the morning, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His sister Carol. She lived 40 minutes south, and she had a specific gift for calling at the exact moment when he least knew what to say, which meant she had a complimentary gift for hearing everything he wasn't saying. He answered. "You sound awake," she said, which was her version of a greeting. I am awake. You didn't sleep. I had a situation. A pause. Carol's pauses were not empty. They were full of the specific patience of a woman who had spent 6 decades in close proximity to a man who communicated in understatements. What kind of situation? The kind that it involves 17 motorcycles and a storm, and a man named Walt, who needs to listen to his cardiologist more carefully. Another pause. Longer. Jack? I'm fine, Carol. I know you're fine. You're always fine. That's not what I asked. Her voice shifted, not softer exactly, but closer. The way her voice got when she was done with the preliminary exchange and was getting to the actual thing. You were going to sign those papers last night. He was quiet. Jack, were you going to sign them? I was going to think about signing them. Your lawyer said. My lawyer isn't here right now, he said, not harshly, just precisely. And last night a group of riders came off the mountain in the worst storm we've had in 30 years, and I spent the night fixing their bikes and drinking bad coffee, and I found out something I didn't know before. What did you find out? He looked at the photograph on the wall. The engine design. The handwritten notation in the margins that he'd put there in 1991, in this exact garage at a workbench not 10 feet from where he was sitting. That I haven't been as forgotten as I thought, he said. The silence on Carol's end was a different kind this time. The kind that fills up with something that isn't ready to be words yet. Tell me, she said finally. So he told her. All of it or most of it. The storm, the bikes, the riders, Walt and his heart condition, and the way he'd let himself be taken care of without too much argument, which Jack said was the most impressive thing about the whole night. He told her about Ryan standing in front of the photograph. About what Ryan had said, the words of it, the specificity of it, the fact that a man who'd been in the motorcycle community for 23 years had stood in this garage and described in detail the influence of a design that Jack had spent 40 years assuming had been absorbed into the general current of things and lost its source. Carol listened without interrupting, which was the greatest courtesy she could offer. When he finished, she said, Jack, that design won you a regional award in 1993. I know. You threw the plaque in the storage room. I know. Because you said awards were for people who needed to be told they were good. He almost smiled. I might have been a little arrogant about that. A little, she agreed. Then quieter. But the point is, you always knew it was good. You stopped believing it mattered that other people thought so. He didn't answer that directly. He looked at the keys on the workbench and the photograph on the wall, and he thought that she was probably right and probably wrong in equal measure, the way family members usually are when they're trying to describe you to yourself. I didn't sign the papers last night, he said. I noticed you didn't say you weren't going to. I'm 69 years old, Carol. I have real numbers in front of me. One good night doesn't change real numbers. No, she said. But it changes you, and you're the one deciding what to do with the numbers. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, I'll bring breakfast. Stay where you are. She hung up before he could tell her not to. He set the phone down on the workbench. He looked around the garage, the aftermath of the night still visible in the arrangement of everything, the extra cups, the positioned bikes now gone, the ghost of a different energy that had been here a few hours ago and left its impression on the space. He picked up the ring of keys. He held them for a moment. Then he set them back down. Not in the lockbox, not in his pocket. On the workbench, where they'd been all night. He got up and started making a fresh pot of coffee. Chad. Carol arrived at 7:40 with a bag from the diner 2 towns over. The one that did the eggs, the way their mother used to, over hard with the edges, lacy and crisp, which was the only way either of them had ever been able to eat eggs without feeling like they were compromising something. She also brought biscuits, which was the diner's one genuine contribution to human happiness, and 2 large coffees in paper cups, because she knew better than to trust whatever Jack had been making on his own since Dorothy died. She set everything on the cleared end of the workbench and looked around the garage without saying anything for a moment. Carol was 65 and sharp-eyed, and the kind of woman who assessed situations the way Jack assessed engines, by feel, by the quality of what she was hearing beneath the obvious surface noise. You cleaned up, she said. Somewhat. The floor's been swept. I sweep the floor. Jack. I've been in this garage 10,000 times. You sweep the floor when you're processing something. He handed her a coffee, his own the bad pot, and accepted one of the paper cups from the diner. I'm always processing something. You're processing something big, she said. She sat down on the stool. Dorothy's stool. She'd always taken Dorothy's stool ever since the funeral, in the quiet and practical way that Carol occupied the spaces that needed occupying. Tell me about the photograph. He'd told her on the phone. She wanted to hear it again, which meant she wanted to watch his face while he said it. He told her again, standing at the workbench with his coffee, watching the biscuits steam in the bag, telling it slightly differently, the second time, the way you always do, finding different words for the same thing, and discovering in the process that the different words show you something the first words didn't. Ryan said it became a ghost story, Jack said. That's the phrase he used. A ghost story in the community. Something that people kept encountering without being able to trace it back. Carol was watching him. How does that make you feel? I don't know yet. Yes, you do. He looked at her. She looked back. The specific stare of a woman who has known someone their whole lives and stopped accepting their evasions sometime in the early 70s. Like I wasted a lot of time grieving something that wasn't actually gone, he said. Carol nodded slowly. And I'm not sure if that makes it better or worse. He set his coffee down. Because if I'd known any part of what Ryan told me last night, I might have made different decisions. About the shop. About what I was fighting for, and whether it was worth fighting for. And now I know, and the situation is the same, but I'm different, and I don't know what to do with that. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Do you remember what Daddy used to say? About the machines he worked on? Jack thought about it. He said a lot of things. He said that a machine doesn't know it's broken, Carol said. It just runs the way it runs. The mechanic is the one who understands the difference between what it is and what it's supposed to be. And the mechanic's job, the whole job, the only job, is to close that gap. Jack looked at his sister. You're saying I'm the machine, he said. I'm saying you've been running broken for a while, she said. Not unkindly, with the straightforwardness of love. And last night somebody showed you what you're supposed to be. And now you know the gap. And you're a mechanic, Jack. So. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. He said nothing for a while. The numbers are still the numbers, he said finally. Then we look at the numbers, Carol said. Together. Like we should have done 6 months ago before you decided to carry this entirely by yourself. She opened the bag and started distributing the food with the efficient practicality of a woman who has been feeding stubborn men their whole lives. Eat your eggs. Then we look at the numbers. Then we figure out what's actually possible and what you've been assuming is impossible because you've been too sad to look at it clearly. He sat down across from her at the workbench. He ate his eggs. They tasted like their mother's kitchen, which tasted like 30 years ago, which tasted like a time when the problems in front of him were still the kind that effort alone could solve. He ate them anyway. 10. The phone rang at 9:15. Not Carol's, Jack's. The shop line which rang on the wall unit that had been there since the 80s, and that Jack had replaced the handset on twice, but never replaced the unit itself, because the base still worked, and he was constitutionally opposed to replacing things that still worked. He looked at it. He hadn't had a call on the shop line in 11 days. He knew this because he'd noted it the way you note things when they start to feel like measurements of something you don't want to measure. He picked it up. Whitmore Garage. A man's voice unfamiliar. Is this Jack Whitmore? It is. Mr. Whitmore, my name is Danny Reeves. I'm a writer out of Great Falls. I got your number from, well, I got it from a chain of people, and I know that sounds strange, but I heard you helped out some writers last night who got caught in the storm on the mountain pass, and I wanted to... A pause, the kind that happens when someone is trying to compress something large into words that fit a phone call. I wanted to ask if you'd be able to look at my bike. I've been having a problem with the fuel system that 3 different shops haven't been able to figure out, and the person who told me your number said you were the one to call. Jack was quiet for a moment. Carol was watching him from her stool legs, halfway to her mouth, listening without pretending she wasn't. "Who gave you this number?" Jack asked. "A man named Walt Hayes," Danny said. "He said to tell you he took his medication this morning." Something moved across Jack's face that he didn't entirely control. Something quick and involuntary, the kind of expression that appears before you can decide whether you're going to show it. "Yeah," Jack said. "Bring the bike in. What day works for you?" "I could come today," Danny said. "If you're open?" Jack looked at Carol. Carol looked at him. The ring of keys was on the workbench between them. "I'm open," Jack said. He hung up. Carol set her fork down very carefully. "Walt Hayes," she said. "Walt Hayes," he confirmed. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the ring of keys. Then back at him. "The numbers," she said. "Yeah. Today." "Yeah." She picked her fork back up. "Okay then," she said. "Let's eat first. The numbers will still be there." Danny Reeves arrived at 11:30. He was in his late 30s, a rancher from outside Great Falls who rode on weekends, and he had been fighting an intermittent fuel surge on his bike for 4 months. He described it the same way Ryan had described the problem the night before, in terms of feel rather than mechanics. What the bike did to his hands and his body, rather than what was happening inside the engine. He'd been to 3 shops. 2 had told him they couldn't replicate the issue. 1 had charged him $400 and fixed nothing. Jack listened with his hands in his pockets. He asked 2 questions. Then he walked to the bike and put his hand flat against the engine casing and stood there with his eyes closed for about 8 seconds, which made Danny Reeves look at Carol, who had stayed ostensibly to help with the numbers, but actually because she wasn't ready to leave yet, with an expression of slightly nervous uncertainty. Carol said quietly, "He's listening." "To what?" "To it." Jack opened his eyes. "Your injector is partially blocked, but that's not the primary problem. Your fuel pressure regulator is failing. It's intermittent, which is why it's hard to replicate on a diagnostic. It only shows when the engine's been running long enough and under the right load conditions. The other shops probably ran the diagnostic cold." Danny stared at him. "How did you—" "The surge pattern you described," Jack said. "It's load dependent. That's not injector behavior, that's regulator behavior. The injector is secondary, probably a consequence of the pressure inconsistency." He straightened. "I can fix both today if you've got time." "I've got time," Danny said. He said it the way people say things when they're slightly stunned. Jack got to work. Carol sat on her stool and watched, and she saw, as she had seen dozens of times over the past 40 years, but perhaps more clearly today than any of those times, the specific transformation that happened to her brother when he was doing the thing he was meant to do. The stiffness left his movements. The age left his face, or not left it exactly, but rearranged itself into something that looked less like burden and more like character. His hands, which in repose were the rough, large-knuckled hands of an old man, became in motion the instruments of someone who was fully and completely in their element. She thought about what she'd said earlier, about the machine, about the mechanic, about the gap between what something is and what it's supposed to be. She thought Jack Whitmore right now was running exactly the way he was supposed to. The phone rang again at 1 o'clock. A woman from Billings whose brother had told her about a mechanic on the mountain who'd helped some riders in the storm. Her own car had been making a sound she couldn't describe except as unhappy. At 1:40 a man called from Livingston. He'd heard from his cousin, who'd heard from a rider who'd gotten a number from someone in the Hells Angels community, who'd said that if you were anywhere near the mountain and your engine was giving you trouble, there was an old mechanic named Whitmore who was worth the drive. At 2:15, while Jack was still working on Danny's bike, and Carol was fielding calls, a truck pulled into the parking lot that Jack didn't recognize. A man got out 50s solid with the unhurried walk of someone who knows where he's going and is not in a rush because he's already made the decision. He came to the side door and knocked. Carol opened it. "Looking for Jack Whitmore," the man said. "He's working," Carol said. "Can I help you?" "My name is Tom Briggs. I run the motorcycle chapter in Billings. Not the same chapter as Ryan Carter, different one. Ryan called me this morning." He paused. He told me about last night. Carol looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and held it open. "Come in," she said. Tom Briggs was not there to get his bike repaired. He was there because Ryan Carter had called him at 7 in the morning, 4 hours before Tom normally woke up on a Friday, and told him a story that Tom described when Carol asked him how he'd heard about it as the kind of story you don't sit still after hearing. He sat at the far end of the workbench and drank Carol's bad coffee without complaining and watched Jack work on Danny Reeves's bike, while Carol stood across from him, and they had a conversation that Jack absorbed and the fuel pressure regulator was only partially tracking. "Ryan said the garage was closing," Tom said. He kept his voice low, not quiet enough that Jack couldn't hear, but calibrated to the space to the fact that there was a man working nearby who might not want this conversation to have an audience, and who also had not asked for it. "There are financial challenges," Carol said. Which was the family version of what Jack had said to Ryan the night before about balance sheets. Ryan also said Jack built the Whitmore design. Tom said this without preamble, because it didn't need preamble. The way you state a fact that is large enough to speak for itself. Carol looked at him. "The Whitmore design. That's what it's called in my community." Tom said it simply. "We didn't know whose it was. Ryan figured it out last night. He said it hit him like..." Tom paused, apparently searching for a word. "Like finding out someone legendary has been living next door this whole time and you just never looked." Carol was very still. "People in my community," Tom said, "would come a long way to work with the mechanic behind the Whitmore design. A long way and a long wait. If that mechanic were taking work." Carol said, "He's been taking work. He's always taken work. The problem is more structural then. I'm not talking about retail walk-in work," Tom said. "I'm talking about custom builds, commission work, the kind of thing that serious builders seek out and pay serious money for. The market for that exists. It exists specifically, and it's bigger than it used to be because the appetite for custom work has grown as the corporate shops have gotten more..." He paused again, "more standardized." Jack had stopped moving. He was still bent over the bike, but his hands had gone still, and the specific quality of his stillness told Carol that he was hearing every word. Tom continued addressing his next words to the room, rather than to Carol specifically. Jack had stopped moving. He was still bent over the bike, but his hands had gone still, and the specific quality of his stillness told Carol that he was hearing every word. Tom continued addressing his next words to the room, rather than to Carol specifically. "I'm not a charity, and I'm not here to offer one. I'm here because Ryan called me and described something I didn't know existed, and because the community I represent has a genuine need for the kind of work that the man in this garage apparently knows how to do." A pause. "If there's interest." Silence. Danny Reeves, who'd been sitting on a crate watching Jack work, and had therefore heard everything, looked at Jack's back. Jack stood up slowly. He turned around. He looked at Tom Briggs across the length of the garage. Tom met his eyes and waited. "You're talking about custom engine work," Jack said. "Not repair." "Repair too," Tom said. "But yes, custom builds, design consultation, the kind of thing that people in my world travel to get done by someone they trust." "I'm one man," Jack said, "in one shop, without the kind of equipment that..." "The people who'd be coming to you aren't looking for equipment," Tom said. "They're looking for knowledge. The equipment is secondary. The knowledge is what you can't buy off a shelf or learn from a computer program." Jack looked at him. Tom looked back. "I'd need to see numbers," Jack said. "I have numbers," Tom said. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper prepared, Jack noted, which meant this conversation had been thought through before Tom Briggs drove 2 hours to have it. "These are commission rates for comparable custom work in our market. These are realistic volume estimates based on existing demand. These are not promises, I want to be clear about that. But they're not wishful thinking either." He set the paper on the workbench. Jack didn't move toward it immediately. He looked at the paper. He looked at Tom. He looked at Carol, who had the expression of a woman physically restraining herself from reacting. He looked at the ring of keys on the workbench. He walked over, picked up the paper, and unfolded it. He read it. He was a slow reader in the same way that he was a slow listener, not because he was slow, but because he gave everything. He read his full attention, the same way he gave his full attention to an engine's symptoms, unwilling to move past a thing until he understood it completely. Carol watched his face. His face did not show much. It never did not while he was processing. The reactions came later after he'd finished with the information. He folded the paper back up. He set it down on the workbench next to the ring of keys. "Danny," he said without looking away from the paper. "Yeah," Danny said from his crate. "Your regulator's going to need about another 40 minutes. After that, she's done." "Take your time," Danny said. He sounded like a man who understood he was witnessing something and was trying to make himself as small as possible so as not to disturb it. Jack looked at Tom. "I have real numbers, not yours, mine. Debt, back payments, the gap between what the shop owes and what it has." "Tell me the number," Tom said. Jack told him. Tom didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man absorbing information and filing it into the calculation he'd already started before he walked through the door. "There are people in my community," Tom said, "who would consider it an investment to help close that gap, in exchange for first access to commission work. Not a gift, a transaction. The kind that writers and craftsmen have been making with each other for as long as both have existed." The garage was very quiet. Danny Reeves had stopped pretending to look at his phone. Carol had stopped pretending to drink her coffee. Jack stood at his workbench with one hand on the folded piece of paper and the ring of keys 6 inches from his fingers and 42 years of work surrounding him on every side. "I don't take charity," he said. "I know," Tom said. "Ryan told me that too." "Then you understand why." "It's not charity," Tom said. "You fixed 17 bikes last night and refused payment. That's charity. What I'm describing is a market. You have something the market wants. The market has something you need. That's not charity. That's commerce." Jack looked at him for a long moment. "Who else did Ryan call this morning?" he said. Tom considered the question. "More than just me," he said carefully. "How many more?" "A few chapters, a few builders, a few people who know other people." Tom paused. "The community moves fast when something important is in it." Jack took a breath. He looked at Carol. Carol looked at him. Between them on the workbench, the ring of keys sat exactly where it had been since he'd taken his hands out of his pockets the night before to start working on the first bike. He picked up the ring of keys. Carol's breath caught just slightly, just enough. He walked to the wall and hung the keys on the hook by the door. The hook that they'd lived on every working day for 42 years, except for the approximately 12 hours when they'd been in his pocket being carried somewhere they were never actually going to go. He turned back to the workbench. "Danny," he said, "let's finish your bike." He picked up his tools. He got back to work. Tom Briggs watched him for a moment. Then he took out his phone and sent a text. Short. 2 words from the look of it. Carol leaned over slightly and said very quietly, "What did you just send?" Tom looked up. "I told Ryan lights are on." Carol turned away before Tom could see her face. She picked up her coffee cup and held it with both hands and looked at the photograph on the wall. The engine design, the handwritten notation, the thing that had been traveling through the world for 40 years while its maker stood here believing it had disappeared, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully realized was tight. At 3:15, Danny Reeves rode out of Whitmore Garage on a bike that ran clean and true for the first time in 4 months. He stopped at the edge of the parking lot and sat for a moment listening to the engine. Then he turned around, drove back to the garage door, and knocked on the frame. Jack looked up. "Tell me something," Danny said. "What you did in there the way you heard it before you even touched it. How do you learn that?" Jack considered the question. "You don't learn it," he said. "You earn it. There's a difference." Danny nodded slowly like a man receiving something he was going to keep. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," he said. He rode out of the lot and down the mountain road. Jack watched him go. Then he went back inside where the phone was already ringing again, and Tom Briggs was on his second cup of bad coffee, and the ring of keys hung on the hook by the door where they belonged, and the light inside Whitmore Garage was on. Tom Briggs left at 4:30, but the phone didn't stop ringing after he walked out the door. If anything, it got worse. Jack answered every call. Not because he had decided anything definitive. Not because the numbers had changed, or the bank had called back, or the situation had transformed into something fundamentally different from what it had been 24 hours ago. He answered every call because answering calls was what you did when the phone rang in a working garage, and Whitmore Garage was apparently still a working garage. Carol stayed until 6. She washed the coffee cups, restocked the supply cabinet with things she'd been quietly bringing for months without announcing she was doing it, and when she finally put her coat on, she stood at the door for a moment and looked at her brother, the way she sometimes looked at him like she was checking something, confirming something, the way you glance back at a flame you've just lit to make sure it caught. "Don't answer the phone past 8, she said. "You need sleep." "I'll think about it." Jack. "I heard you, Carol." She left. He answered the phone at 8:15, 8:40, and 9:03. The calls were coming from everywhere now. Great Falls, Billings, Bozeman. One from a man in Wyoming who said he'd heard through a Facebook group he didn't normally pay attention to a custom motorcycle community page, with apparently several thousand members, where someone had posted a short account of what had happened on the mountain pass the previous night. The post had been shared. The post had been shared again. The post had done what posts do when they touch something real in people, which is travel faster and farther than anyone who wrote them anticipated. The man from Wyoming had a 1978 shovelhead with an engine problem that 2 shops had told him was unfixable without a full rebuild. He didn't want a full rebuild. He wanted someone who understood the engine well enough to know if the rebuild was actually necessary or if it was what shops recommended when they'd run out of ideas. Jack asked him 4 questions. "Bring it up," he said. "Saturday if you can, early." He set the phone down. He stood in the middle of the garage and looked at his appointment book, an actual physical appointment book, spiral-bound, that he'd been using in various forms since 1985. He'd started the current one in January, and most of its pages were empty, which was a specific kind of documentation that he'd been trying not to look at directly for months. He opened it to the current week. He wrote in Saturday. He wrote in the Wyoming man's name Hector and the year and model of the bike, and a brief notation about the symptoms. The handwriting looked strange to him. Not the handwriting itself that hadn't changed, but its presence on a page that had been too empty for too long. He stood and looked at it. Then he looked at the empty pages for the following week. He thought about Tom Briggs and the folded piece of paper on the workbench. He thought about the phone calls, the progression of them, the way they'd come faster. As the afternoon went on, something building momentum out there in the world, in the networks he'd never been part of and hadn't thought about in years. He thought about Ryan Carter somewhere on a road heading back toward Billings, who had made calls starting at 7 in the morning and apparently hadn't stopped making them. He sat down at the workbench with the appointment book in front of him and his pen in his hand, and he looked at the empty pages and didn't fill them in yet, because you didn't fill in appointments that hadn't been confirmed. That was sloppy record-keeping. But he let himself look at them. He let himself look at the possibility of them. And that for tonight was enough. He turned the light off at 10:15. But not the way he'd turned it off the night before. Last night he'd turned it off like a door closing. Tonight he turned it off the way you turn a light off when you're going home and coming back in the morning. The difference is everything. The difference is the whole world. He slept. I was in the garage by 6 the next morning, which was Saturday, which meant he was 3 hours early for Hector's appointment, and 3 years early for the first Saturday that had felt before he opened his eyes like something worth getting up for. High Mata coffee. He swept the floor, not the processing sweep, not the grief sweep, but the ordinary sweep of a man preparing a space for work. He checked his tools the way he'd been checking them every morning for 4 decades, not because anything was ever missing, but because the ritual of it grounded him, set him in his own body and his own day in a way that nothing else quite did. He was recalibrating a torque wrench when the first car pulled into the lot. Not a motorcycle. A car, a late model pickup, clean and well-maintained with Montana plates and a man behind the wheel who Jack didn't recognize. Jack watched through the window without going to the door. The man got out, looked at the sign over the bay doors. Whitmore Garage Est, 1983, and then looked at the building itself in the way people look at places that are older than they expected. He was somewhere in his late 40s, clean-shaved, wearing a jacket that wasn't riding gear. He had a notebook under his arm. Jack went to the door. "We're not open for another," he started. "Mr. Whitmore." The man extended his hand. "My name is Patrick Dunn. I'm a journalist. I write for a magazine called Iron Road. It's a publication for the custom motorcycle community, national distribution, about 40,000 readers. I heard about what happened Thursday night, and I drove up this morning because I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to talk." Jack looked at him. "You drove up from where?" "Missoula. Left at 4 this morning." A pause. "That's a long drive for a maybe." "It's a long drive for a story I think matters," Patrick said. He said it without the particular gloss that journalists sometimes put on things, the salesman quality that makes you aware you're being pitched. He said it the way a man says something he means. "I've been covering the custom motorcycle community for 14 years. I know what the Whitmore design is. I know what it's meant to the people who've built off it. The fact that I'm standing here right now outside the garage where it was designed, talking to the man who made it." He paused. "That's the story. I'd like to write it if you'll let me." Jack looked at him for a long moment. "I haven't agreed to anything," he said, "about any of this. I know. I'm not looking for attention. I understand that. I also think," Patrick said carefully, "that the people who've been influenced by your work deserve to know where it came from. Not for your sake, for theirs. Attribution matters in craft communities. It's how knowledge stays connected to its source." Jack didn't say anything. "I'm not asking you to perform anything," Patrick said. "I'm asking to sit in your garage and watch you work and talk when you feel like talking. That's it." Jack thought about what Danny Reeves had said yesterday, about learning versus earning, about the difference. "Come in," he said. "Coffee's bad, but it's hot." Patrick Dunn sat at the far end of the workbench with his notebook and watched Hector arrive at 9 with the 1978 shovelhead and the engine problem that 2 shops had written off as unfixable without a full rebuild. Hector was a compact, weathered man from Casper who'd owned the bike for 22 years and spoke about it the way certain people speak about old friends, with the specific combination of affection and exasperation that only comes from long commitment. He was nervous. Not about the garage or about Jack, but with the nervousness of a man who has been told twice that the thing he loves is beyond saving, and who has driven 4 hours to hear it a third time from someone who might actually know. Jack heard him out completely. He asked the same 4 questions he'd asked on the phone, confirming the answers, checking them against what Hector's face did when he described each symptom, because the face always told you things the voice didn't, about which moments caused the writer the most alarm, and which the most grief, and grief was often the most reliable diagnostic indicator of where the real problem lived. Then he went to the bike. I didn't touch it for a full minute. He walked around it slowly, looking the way a surgeon looks before the first incision, not for decoration, but because what you see before you touch tells you things that touching alone can't. Patrick's pen was moving in his notebook. Hector was watching Jack with the specific intensity of a man who has stopped breathing without realizing it. "The 2 shops who looked at this," Jack said, walking slowly around the bike. "They both had computers." "Yeah," Hector said. "Both ran full diagnostics. And both said rebuild. Both said there was too much internal wear to address it any other way." Jack stopped. He was at the left side of the engine. He put his hand flat against the casing. The same gesture, the same stillness, the 8-second communion that had made Danny Reeves look uncertain the day before. "How old is your oil?" he said. Hector blinked. "I changed it 2 months ago." Before that I... Hector stopped. His expression changed. "Probably 8 months. 8 months on a bike you were riding regularly." A silence. The kind that feels like something being recognized. "I had a bad stretch," Hector said quietly. "Personal stuff. The bike sat for most of it." Jack nodded. He took his hand off the casing. "Your engine isn't worn out," he said. "It's starved. There's carbon buildup in the upper cylinder from the extended sitting periods, combined with irregular oil changes. The wear your diagnostics picked up is surface wear on the rings, which looks catastrophic on a computer read, but is actually addressable without a full rebuild, if you catch it at the right point. He paused. You're at the right point. Barely, but you're there. Hector stared at him. You got that from the sound it makes under specific load conditions that you described on the phone, and from the oil situation, and from 22 years of riding pattern that you just told me. Jack looked at him directly. The computers measure what's there. They don't account for what was there before. The history of a machine matters as much as its current state. Those shops don't know this bike. I know it now. Hector's jaw had gone tight in the way that men's jaws go tight when they're working very hard not to show that they're moved. Can you fix it? He said. Not today, Jack said. It's going to take most of a week. I need to order a specific ring set. I know the supplier. He's been around since before your bike was new, and the upper cylinder work is methodical, and you can't rush it. But yes. He held Hector's eyes. I can fix it. Hector exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding something for a long time. Leave it with me, Jack said. He turned back to the workbench. I'll call you Wednesday with a progress report. In the corner, Patrick Dunn had stopped writing. He was just watching. The next 3 hours were a conversation that Patrick would later describe in his article as one of the most difficult interviews he'd ever conducted, because it was not an interview at all in any conventional sense. It was two men in a garage, one of them working, and one of them watching, with words moving between them in the irregular rhythm of a man who talks when he has something to say and stops when he doesn't. Patrick was smart enough not to push. He asked about the design. Not about its legacy, not yet, but about its origin. How it came to be. The specific problem Jack had been trying to solve when he made it. Jack was quiet for a moment, hands inside the shovelhead's casing, before he answered. There was a builder who came in here in the late 80s, he said. Young guy, early 20s, building his first custom. He wanted more power output from a smaller displacement, which is the problem everyone wants to solve and nobody solves cleanly. Most solutions at the time were adding displacement or forced induction, both of which create trade-offs in weight and reliability. He paused. I thought the trade-offs were lazy. I thought there was a flow problem that nobody was addressing directly. Flow, Patrick said. Combustion chamber geometry, Jack said. The way fuel and air move inside the chamber during compression and ignition. Everyone was focused on what was going in and what was coming out. Nobody was spending enough time on what was happening in the middle. He pulled his hand back from the casing and reached for a different tool. I spent about 8 months on it, mostly evenings. Dorothy used to sit right there. He nodded toward the stool without looking at it. She'd read while I worked. She said she could tell by the sound I was making, not talking, just the sounds of working, whether I was getting closer or getting further away. Patrick wrote that down. Did she ever say which it was? She said the night I got it, I went quiet for about 30 seconds. And then I said, huh. And she said she put her book down because she knew from the way I said, huh, that I'd found it. Patrick looked up from his notebook. Jack had a faint expression on his face that was not quite a smile, and not quite not one. She was right, he said. That's exactly what happened. Patrick wrote for a moment. Then he said, did she know what it became? The design, did she know it spread? Jack thought about that. She knew I was proud of it. She knew I'd put it into a couple of builds over the years. She didn't. He paused. We didn't have the internet the way people do now. The community was different. Things moved slower and less visibly. If it was being talked about, it wasn't in places we were looking. He set the tool down. No, I don't think she knew the full scope of it. He was looking at the stool now. I wish she had, he said. She would have been. He stopped, started again. She was always more certain about my work than I was. She would have had every right to say she'd told me so. Patrick let the silence sit. He was experienced enough to know that some things you don't fill in, you let them be what they are. After a moment, he said, when Ryan Carter told you last Thursday night, when he stood in front of that photograph and told you what the design had become, what was the first thing you felt? Jack looked at the workbench. Angry, he said. Patrick hadn't expected that. Angry. Not at Ryan, not at anyone in particular. Jack picked up the tool again, turned it over in his hands. Angry at all the time I spent not knowing, all the years of thinking it had gone nowhere, all the... He stopped. His jaw set and then released. I made decisions based on that belief, about what I was worth, about what this place was worth, about whether it was still worth fighting for. He looked at Patrick directly. You ask someone to fight for something, and then you tell them what they were fighting for after they've quit. That makes you angry, even when you know nobody meant it that way. Patrick held his pen still. And then, he said. Jack looked back at the engine. And then the anger passes, he said. And what's underneath it is... He searched for the word. Grateful, which is worse in some ways. Grateful is harder to carry than angry. Angry has somewhere to go. Grateful just sits in you. He went back to work. Patrick sat with what he'd just heard and understood that he was going to structure his entire article around that exchange, that this was the center of the story, not the dramatic night, not the famous design, not the unlikely meeting between a failing garage and a motorcycle community, but a man in his late 60s saying the word grateful, like it was something complicated, like it was something that cost him something to admit. At 12:30, while Jack was on the phone with his parts supplier, the one who'd been around since before Hector's bike was new, a man named Gerald, who ran a specialty shop in Nevada, and who, when Jack explained what he needed and why, immediately said he'd pull the ring set from his personal stock and have it on a truck by Monday morning. Patrick stepped outside to make a call of his own. He called his editor. You need to hold 3 pages, he said when his editor picked up. Patrick, we're closing the issue on Tuesday. I know, hold 3 pages. A pause. How good is it? Patrick looked at the garage, at the hand-painted sign. EST 1983, at the light coming through the bay windows. It's the best thing I've found in 14 years, he said. Hold the pages. He went back inside. What happened next was the twist that nobody in the garage was prepared for, including Patrick, who thought he'd arrived with a reasonably complete picture of what the story was. It was 1:15 in the afternoon. Jack was updating his appointment book, 3 new entries, the pages that had been empty, filling in with a velocity that would have seemed impossible 72 hours ago. And Patrick was reviewing his notes, and the garage was carrying the particular comfortable energy of a place that has found its rhythm again after a period of disruption. The phone rang. Jack picked it up. Whitmore Garage. A pause on the other end, long enough to be noticeable. Then a man's voice, older, careful, with the particular quality of someone who has prepared what they're going to say and is now saying it. Is this Jack Whitmore, the mechanic? It is. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm calling from Chicago. Another pause. I'm a patent attorney. Jack's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on the phone. Patrick looked up from his notes. I'm listening, Jack said. Mr. Whitmore. I've been contacted by several members of the custom motorcycle community this week regarding a custom engine design that has been attributed to you. Specifically, a combustion chamber geometry modification that was developed approximately 30 years ago and has since been incorporated in various derivative forms into a significant number of commercial and custom builds. He paused. I need to ask you some questions about the documentation of that design. Jack said, What kind of questions? Mr. Whitmore, if you created that design and it was never properly patented, you may have significant common law intellectual property claims, depending on how the design has been used in commercial applications. There are some manufacturers, not custom builders, actual manufacturers, who incorporated derivative versions of this geometry into production engines without attribution or licensing. A beat. The community members who contacted me believe the timeline and documentation may support a claim. I'm calling to find out if you have any original documentation. Jack stood very still. What kind of documentation? He said. Original sketches, dated notes, Anything that establishes the creation date and the original design specifications in your hand. Jack looked at the photograph on the wall, the engine design, the handwritten notation in the margins. The photograph he'd hung there not for display, but for proximity, because he'd wanted it near. His eyes moved to the storage room door at the back of the garage. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I might have some documentation." "Mr. Whitmore," Robert Callahan said, and his voice had something new in it. Not excitement exactly, but the controlled precision of a man who has just received confirmation of something he already suspected. "Would you be able to tell me approximately how much documentation you have?" Jack thought about the storage room. He thought about the filing system he'd maintained since 1983, the one that Carol called obsessive and that Jack called professional. He thought about the boxes he'd never thrown away, because throwing things away felt like erasing something, and Jack Whitmore had never been able to erase his own work. He thought about the original drafting notebook from 1991, spiral-bound pages, slightly yellowed with every iteration of the combustion chamber. Geometry documented in precise handwritten notation with dates, because Jack had always dated his notes, because that was what you did when you were serious about what you were creating. "How much?" he said. "Mr. Callahan, I have everything. Every iteration, every date, 30 years of it." The silence on the other end of the phone was its own kind of language. "Mr. Whitmore," Robert Callahan said, "I'm going to need to come see you in person." Patrick Dunn had put his pen down. He was staring at Jack. Jack looked at him and saw the expression on the journalist's face and understood it because it was probably the same expression that was on his own face. The expression of a man who has come to a garage expecting one story and is standing inside a completely different one. He told Callahan when he could come. He wrote it in the appointment book, Robert Callahan, attorney, in the same handwriting he'd used to write Hector's appointment and Danny's and the others. Same pen, same book, same workbench. He hung up. He and Patrick looked at each other across the garage. "Did you know?" Patrick said. "No," Jack said. The word came out flat and certain. "I designed something. I didn't patent it because I didn't have the money for an attorney in 1991, and I didn't think—" He stopped, looked at the ceiling. "I didn't think it was going anywhere." "But it went everywhere," Patrick said quietly. "Apparently. And manufacturers used it. Apparently." Patrick picked his pen back up. His hand was not entirely steady. "Jack, what you just described, if there's commercial use of a derivative design without attribution or licensing, and if you have the documentation that establishes the original creation." "I know what it means," Jack said. He said it quietly, not cutting Patrick off, but absorbing something that required space. "I know what it might mean. Might." He held up one finger, emphasis caution. "Might. I'm not a lawyer, and I've been surprised by situations before that looked clearer than they were." "Of course," Patrick said. He was writing. "But the documentation—" "Let me show you something," Jack said. He walked to the storage room door and opened it. I was inside for 4 minutes. Patrick could hear him moving through the space, the sound of boxes being moved, specific and purposeful, the search of a man who knows exactly what he's looking for and exactly where it is. He came back out with a box. Plain cardboard labeled in black marker in Jack's handwriting, Engine Design, Combustion Project, 1989-1993. He set it on the workbench. He opened it. Inside, organized in the meticulous way of a man who takes his own work seriously, were notebooks, loose sketches, printed photographs of prototype builds and documentation that went all the way back to the first rough concept sketches from 1989. Hand-dated, annotated, the complete creative and technical record of the development of the Whitmore design from first idea to final form. Patrick looked at the box. He looked at the contents. He looked at the dates on the top pages. "Jack," he said. "Yeah. This is everything." I told him that. Patrick looked up. There was a quality in his face that was beyond the journalist, now past the professional assessment, into the genuinely human response of a person looking at something that matters. "What are you feeling right now?" he said. Jack looked at the box. At the notebooks. At 30 years of work that he'd stored in a cardboard box in a storage room because it had nowhere else to go, and he couldn't make himself throw it away. "I'm feeling," he said carefully, "like I probably should have hired that attorney in 1991. Patrick made a sound that was half laugh, half exhale. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." Jack closed the box. He carried it to the lockbox, the one where he'd put the bank papers. The ones his lawyer needed, notarized the ones he'd been about to sign on Thursday night before 17 motorcycles arrived through a storm and interrupted what would have been the last night of his life inside this garage. He didn't put the box inside the lockbox. He set it on top of it. He looked at the lockbox for a moment. At the bank papers inside it. At the document box sitting on top of it. He thought about 30 years of a design traveling through the world without his name attached to it. He thought about manufacturers, actual manufacturers, not custom builders, but production operations with legal departments and licensing agreements and revenue streams, incorporating derivative geometry into commercial engines. He thought about what that might mean legally and financially if the documentation was what it appeared to be. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer. Not the one who'd told him to sign the papers. A different number, a name he'd been given by Tom Briggs that morning, a firm in Billings that specialized in intellectual property, and had Tom said experience in exactly this kind of creative attribution case. The phone rang twice. "This is Whitmore," he said when someone answered. "I need to speak with someone about a design claim. I have documentation going back to 1989. And I've just been told that the design may have been incorporated into commercial production without licensing." He paused. "I was also told you handle these cases." Another pause. "Yes, I can come in Monday." He reached for the appointment book. "What time?" He wrote it down. He hung up. He stood at the workbench for a moment, with his hand flat on the surface on the wood worn smooth by 40 years of this exact posture. Outside, a motorcycle pulled into the lot. Another one followed 30 seconds later. Jack looked through the window. Two bikes he didn't recognize, riders he didn't know, helmets off and looking at the sign above the bay doors. Whitmore Garage East, 1983. With the particular intentionality of people who have driven somewhere specific because they know where they're going. He went to the bay door and opened it. One of the riders, a woman in her 40s with a gray streak in her dark hair, and the easy physical confidence of someone who'd been riding since before it was considered unusual for women to ride, raised her hand in a wave. "Jack Whitmore," she said. "That's me. My name is Sarah. I came from Bozeman." She paused. "I heard the story, about Thursday night, about the design, about all of it. I wanted to come and—" She looked at her riding partner, a man about the same age, then back at Jack. "I just wanted to come and say thank you. Because I've been riding a bike for 6 years that's built on a derivative of your design. I didn't know who made it. I know now." She paused again. "And I wanted the person who made it to know what it means to someone who rides on it every day." Jack looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at Walt Hayes in the middle of the night, with the specific attention of a man who understands that something important is happening and is trying to stay present to it, rather than let it pass before he's fully absorbed it. "Come in," he said. "I just made a fresh pot." Patrick Dunn in the corner opened his notebook to a new page. He had a feeling he was going to need it. Sarah and her riding partner stayed for 2 hours. Their names were Sarah Kowalski and Greg Marsh. And they had driven up from Bozeman on a Saturday afternoon, not because they needed anything repaired, and not because they had any business to conduct, but because Sarah had read the post in the community group that morning, and had looked at her partner and said simply, "We're going." Greg, who had been with Sarah long enough to know when a statement like that was an invitation to discussion, and when it wasn't, had put on his jacket without a word. Jack poured them coffee, and they sat on the 2 crates near the workbench, and what followed was not a formal conversation. It had no agenda, no structure, no particular direction. It was the kind of talking that happens when people are in the same space, and there is something real between them, even though they are meeting for the first time. Sarah described the bike she rode. A custom build she'd commissioned 4 years ago from a builder in Bozeman who'd recently retired, a man named Fletcher, who had been building customs for 30 years, and who had, when he designed her engine, mentioned in passing that the combustion geometry he was working from traced back to something he'd learned from another builder in the late 90s who had in turn learned it from someone else. A chain of knowledge passing hand to hand over decades, each link aware that what they carried mattered, but none of them certain where it had originated. Fletcher said it was Montana, Sarah told Jack. He said whoever designed it was from Montana and was probably still out there somewhere. He said he'd always wanted to find the source. She paused. He passed away last year. He never did. Jack held his coffee cup with both hands and listened without interrupting. The bike he built me, Sarah continued, runs differently than anything I've ridden before. I've been riding for 20 years, and I've been on a lot of engines, and there's something about the way this one breathes. She stopped, apparently surprised by her own word choice. That's not a technical description. No, Jack said, but it's accurate. She looked at him. You designed it to breathe differently. I designed it to stop fighting itself, he said. Every engine has internal turbulence, the fuel-air mixture creating conflict inside the chamber during compression. Most designs manage the turbulence. I was trying to eliminate a specific category of it, the way the mixture moves in the moment before ignition. He set his coffee down. When you get that right, the power delivery is smoother. The engine doesn't surge or fight at transition points. It feels like it wants to go, Sarah said. Jack looked at her. Yeah, like it wants to go. They looked at each other across the garage, with the specific recognition of people who have arrived at the same understanding from different directions. One through 30 years of creating it, one through years of living inside what he'd made. Patrick had 3 pages of notes and wasn't slowing down. At 3:15, Sarah stood to leave. She shook Jack's hand, and then she did something that Jack hadn't anticipated. She held his hand in both of hers for a moment, the same double grip that Walt Hayes had used at the door 2 days before the grip. That means more than a handshake and less than an embrace, and carries in that middle space everything that doesn't have adequate words. Fletcher would have loved meeting you, she said. Jack nodded. His throat moved. Tell me his last name, he said. I'll add him to the wall. Sarah looked at the photograph wall, at the collage of decades. Fletcher Grant, she said. Jack went to the wall. He wrote the name on a piece of shop tape, the way he'd always tag things in the garage, practical and immediate, and pressed it to the lower edge of the engine design photograph. Sarah watched him do it. When she and Greg walked out to their bikes, she stopped once at the door and turned back. Mr. Whitmore, the man who opened his garage. Thursday night, the riders who needed help are going to talk about that for the rest of their lives. But I want you to know something. She paused. The people who've been riding on what you made, and there are more of us than you know, we've been carrying a piece of you for years, without knowing it. You were already with us. She went out the door. Jack stood and looked at the piece of shop tape on the photograph. Fletcher Grant. He thought about the chain. The builder who learned from a builder who learned from someone else. The design that had moved through the community like a river that keeps its character even as it changes course, that feeds tributaries that have never seen the source. He thought about all the riders who had been, as Sarah put it, carrying a piece of him without knowing it. He thought about Dorothy sitting on her stool putting her book down because of the way he'd said, "Huh." You were right, he said softly to no one in the room who was living. You always said it went further than I knew. Patrick wrote that down too. The call from Ryan Carter came at 4:45. Jack picked up on the second ring. He'd been half expecting it, not at this specific time, not with any particular foreknowledge, but in the general way that you expect certain people to reappear when the story of a thing is still moving. How's the garage? Ryan said. No preamble. Busy, Jack said, and meaning it, which was the remarkable part. Tom called me, Ryan said. I figured. Patrick Dunn, too, he texted. A pause. Jack, the attorney. Callahan. Yeah. How did... Ryan stopped himself. I didn't send Callahan your way. I didn't know about that angle. Apparently someone else in your community did the math, Jack said. Apparently. A beat. What's your read on it? Jack thought about the document box sitting on top of the lockbox. About the IP attorney appointment on Monday. About the careful, controlled voice of Robert Callahan on the phone saying, "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to need to come see you in person." "My read is that I need to talk to a lawyer before I form a read," Jack said. "Which is probably something I should have done 30 years ago, but here we are." "Here we are," Ryan agreed. Then quieter. "I need to tell you something about why I really called Tom that morning." Jack waited. "The design isn't the only reason," Ryan said. "The design that's remarkable, and I meant everything I said about it. But that's not the thing that made me get on the phone at 7 in the morning and start calling people." He paused, and in the pause, Jack could hear road noise, which meant Ryan was riding, which meant he was having this conversation on the move, in the particular way that certain people process important things best in motion going somewhere. "Then what is?" Jack said. "The door," Ryan said. Jack said nothing. "We pulled up to your garage at 10 at night in the worst storm in 30 years, Ryan said. 17 of us. Bikes failing, one man in medical trouble, all of us in leather jackets with patches that told a very specific story to most people we encountered that night. 3 stops before yours turned us away. The last one." He stopped. "The last one before yours had a man who came out of the back with a baseball bat to make sure we kept moving. Not kidding." Jack was very still. "And then we got to your garage," Ryan said. "And the lights were off. And I knocked. And you opened the door 4 inches. And you looked at us. And you—" Another pause. "You didn't see what they saw. Those other places they saw 17 Hells Angels in a storm, and they saw a threat to be managed. You opened the door, and you saw 17 people who needed help." He let that sit. "That's the thing," Ryan said. "The design is the history, the door is the character, and the character is what I couldn't stop thinking about. Because in my experience—" His voice shifted slightly. Something more personal moving through it now. "In my experience, character. Like that doesn't exist in a garage that's about to disappear. It exists in a place that should be here. And I was not going to let it disappear without at least trying to stop it." Jack's hand was tight on the phone. He looked at the door. The actual door. The side door. The one he'd unlatched the security chain on at 10:11 on Thursday night. The door that was 4 inches of wood between 17 tired, cold, wet riders and another rejection. He'd opened it without thinking. He'd never thought of it as a decision. It hadn't felt like a decision. It had felt like the only possible response to what was in front of him. "It wasn't heroic," Jack said. "Opening the door. It's just what you do." "I know," Ryan said. "That's the point. For you, it was just what you do. That's exactly the point." A long silence. "Walt called me this morning," Jack said. "He didn't mention the heart thing. He talked for 20 minutes about the shovelhead I've got in here." Ryan laughed, "a real one, the kind you can't manufacture." "He texted the whole group last night, told everyone your number, and told everyone to spread it. He said, and I quote, 'This man fixed our bikes, saved my life, and makes terrible coffee. Call him.'" Jack made a sound that was the closest he'd come to laughing in longer than he could accurately remember. "The coffee's not that bad." "Jack, the coffee is that bad." "It's consistent," Jack said. "I'll give it that." "Consistent is something," Ryan allowed. Then back to business, the way Ryan moved, smooth transitions, no wasted time. "I want to come back. Not to bring more business your way, not to manage any of this. You don't need me to manage anything. But I want to come back and sit in your garage for an afternoon and just—" He paused. "Just be somewhere that feels like what that garage felt like Thursday night." "You're welcome any time," Jack said. And meant it with a completeness that surprised him slightly, because Jack Whitmore had spent the last 7 years in a progressively quieter and less populated world, and the idea of wanting company-specific chosen company was one he'd largely stopped entertaining. "Saturday after next," Ryan said. "I'll bring Walt. Tell Walt to bring his medication." "He won't forget," Ryan said. "I'll make sure of it." He hung up. Jack set the phone down and stood for a moment with his hand on the workbench, and something moving through him that he couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word, too light for what it was. It was something more structural, like a beam being replaced in a load-bearing wall, like something that had been subtly wrong for a long time, being made right in a way that you felt in your body, before your mind fully registered it. The magazine article came out 3 weeks later. Patrick Dunn's piece in Iron Road ran to 6 pages more than he'd requested, and significantly more than his editor had initially agreed to. But by the time Patrick submitted the draft, his editor had read it twice and called him and said without preamble, "We're moving the cover story." The article was titled, "The Mechanic Who Built the Engine Nobody Could Name." It was by any measure the best thing Patrick had written in 14 years of covering the custom motorcycle community. Not because of the drama of it, though there was plenty, but because he had managed to do the rarest thing in journalism, which is to write about a person in a way that made the reader feel they understood not just what that person had done, but who they were. The Jack Whitmore on those 6 pages was the Jack that the garage already knew, precise and quiet and extraordinarily good at what he did with a grief underneath that had been sitting on him like a second skin, and a stubbornness that had been depending on when you caught him, either his greatest strength or his primary obstacle. The magazine hit newsstands on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Jack's phone had rung 27 times. By the following Monday, the day Robert Callahan, the patent attorney, drove up from Chicago to sit at the workbench and go through the documentation box page by page, with the careful attention of a man who understands that what he's holding is both historical and potentially legally significant. The appointment book had entries running 5 weeks out. Callahan spent 4 hours with the documentation. He was a methodical man, careful and precise, and he moved through the notebooks and sketches and dated notes without rushing, occasionally asking Jack a question that was always specific. Not what Jack felt about something, but what Jack had intended. What problem he had been solving at a particular moment. What the handwritten notation in the margin of a specific sketch referred to. Jack answered every question without uncertainty. It was his work. He knew every page of it the way you know the inside of your own mind. At the end of 4 hours, Callahan closed the last notebook and looked at Jack across the workbench. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "the documentation is exceptional. The dating is consistent and corroborated by external references throughout supplier receipts. Dated correspondence shop logs that align with the development timeline. The design is clearly yours. The creation date is clearly established, and the progression from concept to final form is documented in more detail than I typically see even in cases that were being managed by IP counsel from the beginning." Jack waited. "The common law claim is strong," Callahan said. "Stronger than I expected, honestly. The question of commercial use by manufacturers is going to require additional research. I'll need to engage an expert to trace the specific derivatives in production engines and establish the degree of correspondence with your design. That takes time. It also takes money up front, which I want to be transparent about." "How much time?" Jack said. "Minimum 6 months for the investigation phase. If we find what I expect to find, the claim process could extend 18 months to 2 years beyond that." Jack absorbed that. "And if you find what you expect," Callahan looked at him steadily. "The numbers involved in commercial engine licensing, even in retrospective claims, can be substantial. I don't want to give you a figure that creates false expectations because these cases are not linear and they are not guaranteed. But I want you to understand that the reason I drove 6 hours from Chicago to sit here today is because I believe this documentation supports a claim that is worth pursuing." A silence. Jack looked at the documentation box. At 30 years of a spiral notebook and loose sketches and dated receipts that had been sitting in a storage room because he couldn't make himself throw them away. "My father used to say," Jack said slowly, "that the only work worth doing is work you'd be willing to sign your name to." He looked at Callahan. "I signed my name to every page in that box." Callahan nodded. "I can see that." "Then let's pursue it," Jack said. Callahan reached into his briefcase and produced a client agreement. He set it on the workbench. Jack looked at it for a moment. Then he reached into the lockbox, the one with the bank papers, the papers his original lawyer had told him to sign, and he took out those papers. He set them beside Callahan's client agreement. 2 documents on the same workbench, one representing the end of something, one representing the beginning of something. He picked up the bank papers first. He looked at them one more time at the numbers on them, the dates, the language of closure. He'd been carrying these papers for months. They'd sat in this lockbox like a verdict he'd been waiting to accept. He set them aside face down. He picked up Callahan's client agreement. He read it the same way he read everything, completely carefully, without skipping. Callahan waited without fidgeting, which Jack appreciated. Patient people were rare and valuable. He signed it. He handed it back. "One more thing," Callahan said, returning the copy to his briefcase. "The community members who first contacted me, Ryan Carter, and several others. They have indicated willingness to provide supporting statements about the design's provenance and the community's historical understanding of its Montana origins. That kind of contextual testimony can be valuable in establishing the design's identity in the relevant market. Are you comfortable with them being involved in that capacity?" Jack thought about Ryan on the phone talking about the door, about the character of a place, about driving 6 hours and calling at 7 in the morning because something felt important enough not to let go. "Yeah," he said. "I'm comfortable with that." Callahan packed his briefcase. He shook Jack's hand firm and briefed the handshake of a man who respects other people's time, including his own. At the door he stopped. He turned back. "Mr. Whitmore, in 14 years of IP work, I've seen people who created things that mattered and never received recognition for them. It's more common than people think." He paused. "The ones who take it hardest are usually the ones who cared the most about the work itself, not the recognition. Which is also the reason the work was usually worth recognizing in the first place." He looked at Jack steadily. "You're going to be all right." He went out. Jack stood at the workbench. He picked up the bank papers from where he'd set them face down. He looked at them one more time. Then he walked to the phone and called his lawyer, the original one, and said that he was not going to sign the settlement agreement at this time, and that the situation had changed in ways he wanted to discuss. His lawyer was quiet for a moment. Then, "Jack, the deadline on this—" "I know the deadline," Jack said. "I'm asking you to request an extension. Tell them the owner is exploring other financial options and will respond by the end of the month." "What other financial options?" "I'll explain when we meet," Jack said. "Can you get the extension?" A pause. "Probably. Banks don't love foreclosing on longtime property owners. It's bad optics. They'll push back, but they'll extend." Another pause. "Jack, what happened?" Jack looked around the garage. At the appointment book with 5 weeks of entries. At the documentation box. At the photograph on the wall with Fletcher Grant's name on a piece of shop tape. At the ring of keys on the hook by the door. "Someone opened a door," Jack said, "and it turned out there was a lot on the other side of it." His lawyer was quiet for a moment, apparently deciding whether that was a complete answer. "I'll call the bank," he said. The following Saturday, Ryan Carter came back. He came with Walt Hayes as promised, and with 3 other writers from the Thursday night group, Craig, who had some mechanical background himself, and had watched Jack work with the focused attention of a student. Derek, the retired veteran from Billings, and Marcus Webb, Ryan's road captain, who had spent the night of the storm looking after Walt, and who had Jack learned mentioned Whitmore Garage to roughly 40 people in the 10 days since. They pulled in at 10 in the morning, and they came with tools. Not metaphorically, literally. They arrived with toolboxes and materials, and a utility trailer that carried lumber and roofing supplies, and 2 men from a Billings construction company who were friends of Derek's, and who had agreed to come on a Saturday because Derek had told them the story, and the story had apparently been enough. Jack stood in the bay door and watched them unload. He looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at him. His expression was the expression of a man who knows he is about to get some version of argument and has decided in advance not to lose it. "The roof," Ryan said simply. "It's been leaking. You've got water damage in the back corner. We're fixing it." Jack opened his mouth. "Not charity," Ryan said before a word came out. "Work exchange. You fixed our bikes. We fix your roof. Simple transaction. Don't make it into something it isn't." Jack closed his mouth. Walt appeared from behind the trailer, carrying what appeared to be a very good thermos. He walked past Jack into the garage, found the stool, Dorothy's stool, and sat down on it, as if he'd been sitting there for years. "Before you argue," Walt said, pouring from the thermos into the cup he'd also apparently brought. "I have to tell you that I spoke to my cardiologist this week. Told him what happened in this garage. He said, and I'm quoting directly, 'That old mechanic probably saved your life, so if he needs a roof, you build him a damn roof.'" He took a sip. "Doctor's orders." Jack looked at Walt. Walt looked back at him with the unperturbed steadiness of a man who has made his peace with the situation and is not available for renegotiation. Jack looked at Ryan. Ryan was already directing the construction crew toward the back corner of the building, pointing at the water damage, explaining what he knew about the structure from looking at it on Thursday night, because of course Ryan Carter had assessed the building's structural issues while he was in it, because Ryan was the kind of man who assessed everything. Jack looked at the crew. He looked at the riders. He looked at Walt on Dorothy's stool. "The coffee maker's on," he said. "Help yourselves." "Already noticed," Walt said, examining the machine. "It looks like it predates me. I brought my own." "The coffee is fine," Jack said. "The coffee," Walt said with the authority of a man who takes coffee seriously, "is a cry for help. Drink this." He poured from his thermos into a spare cup and handed it across. Jack took it. He drank it. It was genuinely significantly better than his coffee. He did not say this out loud. Walt watched his face and smiled. Outside, the sound of work began. The specific percussion of a construction crew in motion, voices coordinating materials, being positioned, the industry of people who know what they're doing and are doing it together. Craig had come inside and was looking at the shovelhead Hector's bike still in mid-repair with the focused curiosity of a man who wants to understand something and isn't afraid to ask. "Can I watch?" Craig said. "While you work on it, I won't touch anything." "You can do more than watch," Jack said. "Get over here." Craig's face did what faces do when they're given something they wanted but hadn't let themselves ask for directly. He got over there. Jack began to explain the ring replacement process. Not as a performance, not for Patrick Dunn, who wasn't here today, just between two people at a workbench, one of whom knew something and one of whom wanted to learn it, which was the oldest and most reliable form of education that exists. Outside, the roof work continued. Inside, the shovelhead's engine came apart in Jack's hands with the practiced ease of a man in his element, and Craig asked questions that were better than Jack expected, and Walt sat on Dorothy's stool and drank his good coffee, and occasionally said something that made both of them laugh, and the morning moved through the garage, the way good mornings move, with weight and warmth, and the feeling that what's happening right now matters, that this hour is one you'll carry with you. At noon, Ryan came inside. His jacket was off his sleeves, rolled up, and he had the look of a man who has been working hard and is satisfied about it. He poured himself coffee from Jack's machine, drank a mouthful, and then looked at Walt with an expression of profound suffering. "Walt." "I know," Walt said, already extending his thermos. Ryan switched cups. He sat on an overturned crate and looked around the garage. At the shovelhead on the lift, Craig leaning in with Jack talking him through what he was seeing. At the appointment book on the workbench. At the photograph wall with its decades of accumulation and the small piece of shop tape at the bottom edge of the engine design photograph. "Fletcher Grant," Ryan read. He looked at Jack. "Who's that?" Jack told him. About Sarah. About the chain of knowledge about the builder in Bozeman who had died before finding the source. About what Sarah had said at the door. About adding the name to the wall. Ryan was quiet for a moment. "How many people do you think have built off your work?" he said. Jack thought about it. "I have no idea. I've been trying not to think about the number because it makes it hard to focus." "It's more than you're imagining," Ryan said. "Even when you think you're imagining a lot." Jack looked at the photograph. "I know," he said. A pause. "It's a strange thing," Jack said, "to find out that you've been part of people's lives without knowing it. People writing every day on something you made not knowing your name. Fletcher Grant, teaching someone your geometry without knowing where it came from." He paused. "I spent years thinking my work disappeared. But it didn't disappear. It just left home. The way kids leave home. It went out into the world and became part of other people's lives and stopped needing to come back and report in." Ryan said nothing. He was listening the way he'd listened the night of the storm, with his full attention without filling in the spaces. "I think that's actually how it's supposed to work," Jack said. "I think that's what good work does. It leaves. It becomes part of what other people build. And the person who made it is supposed to know that's enough." He paused. I forgot that. For a while. I forgot that enough was enough." The roof crew made a sound overhead. A boom of something being repositioned, followed by a voice calling down to someone outside. The garage absorbed it the way a working garage absorbs noise naturally, without surprise. Craig at the workbench had stopped listening to the internal conversation and was absorbed in the engine, which meant Jack had taught him enough to get him to that point of self-directed attention. That was the first real sign of a person who was going to be capable. Walt was on his second cup of coffee. The appointment book had 5 weeks of entries. The bank extension had been confirmed that morning, 30 days, which was 30 days more than Jack had had 4 days ago. The documentation box was in Callahan's hands, being assembled into something that might, in 18 months or 2 years, change the financial landscape of everything. The roof was being repaired by 17 people, well by the 4 people on the construction crew, while the writers did what they could and stayed out of the professionals' way, which was its own form of help. Jack Whitmore stood in the middle of his garage on a Saturday morning, with an engine in front of him and a student beside him, and the sound of community working around him and over him, and he felt something that he recognized dimly from a very long time ago. He felt like himself, not the self of the last 7 years. The quieter, smaller version. The one carrying grief and financial pressure, and the slow erosion of believing in his own relevance. The earlier self. The one who had opened this garage at 27 with a toolbox and a reputation, and the absolute conviction that if you were good enough and honest enough and worked hard enough, the work itself would make the case for you. He'd been right about that. He'd just been wrong about the timeline. The work had made the case. It had just done it quietly over 30 years without his knowledge, in the way that real things often do, without announcement, without ceremony, in the daily lives of people who never knew his name, but who rode every morning on what his hands had made. He thought about Thursday night. About the lights going off. About the ring of keys in his pocket, and the papers in the lockbox, and the specific kind of silence that exists in a place where something great used to live. He thought about knocking. About a door opening 4 inches. About 17 people coming in from the storm. He picked up his tools. He bent over the shovelhead's engine. "All right, Craig," he said. "See this here? This is where most people stop looking. This is exactly where you need to start." She stayed, not as a guest, not as the schoolteacher Harrington had hired from Boston, not as the woman who had been sent to fix a man who turned out not to be broken. She stayed as someone who had chosen it deliberately, with full knowledge of what it cost, and what it gave, the way adults choose the things that actually matter. The first month after the Daltons left was the quietest month the ranch had seen in years. Not the held breath quiet of a place waiting for the next disaster. The genuine quiet of a place that has come through something, and is now carefully learning how to simply exist. Cole noticed it before she did. One evening he came in from the south pasture. The same south pasture where the fire had been, where the fence had been broken, and broken again, where he had stood alone so many mornings carrying more than any one person should carry. And he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the table. Clara was at one end, helping the eldest cousin with something written. Ellie was drawing at the other end with her tongue between her teeth. The cook had left a pot on the stove, and the smell of it was filling the room. Cole stood in the doorway for a long moment. She looked up and found him there. "What?" she said. He shook his head slowly. Something in his expression she had come to recognize, the look of a man who is receiving something he had stopped believing was available to him. "Nothing," he said. "It's good." He came in and sat down. He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't need to. She understood him now. That was the thing that had happened somewhere between the south fence line and the stable and the porch. She had learned the language of him. Not just the words, but what lived underneath them. The silences that meant he was moved. The stillness that meant he was deciding. The precise flat tone he used for things that actually mattered, as though the most important things required the steadiest delivery. She had learned him, and every day she found that he was learning her. He noticed, for instance, that she got quiet when she was worried. Not the productive quiet of thinking, but a different quality, a slightly too still quality. He had started responding to that quiet before she identified it herself. Coming to find her, not always with words, sometimes just being in the same room, sitting nearby, letting the fact of his presence say what he wasn't yet comfortable saying with language. She found this more eloquent than most people's words. Danny noticed the change before anyone else named it out loud. He was good at noticing things, and better than most at knowing when not to comment on them. But one afternoon, about 6 weeks after the Daltons' last visit, he found Clara near the stable and said simply, "He smiles now. Did you know that actual smiles? Not the maybe smile, actual ones." Clara kept her expression neutral. "I've noticed. The hands have noticed too." Danny paused. "It's a little unnerving, honestly. We're still adjusting." "Give it time," she said. "We're trying," he smiled. He pushed back on Cal being replaced, by the way. Not because he forgave him, I don't think that's happened yet. Maybe it never does entirely. But he told Harrington he wanted whoever came in to be given a fair chance. That a man's first month shouldn't define him. Danny paused. He said something like, "The worst mistake isn't starting wrong, it's being too proud to correct it." Clara stopped walking. She turned to look at Danny. "He said that?" she asked. "Word for word." Danny studied her expression. "That's something you said to him, isn't it?" She turned back and kept walking. "I may have said something like it," she said. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know what's interesting about Cole? He doesn't borrow things. He's too stubborn for that. So when he says something that sounds like someone else, it means he believed it enough to make it his own." She carried that sentence with her for the rest of the day. She was still carrying it at dinner. And Cole across the table looked at her once, just once, with the direct, clear gaze she had come to understand meant he knew something was on her mind and was making himself available when she was ready. She waited until after dinner. "Danny told me what you said," she said. "About the new hand." He looked at her steadily. "The worst mistake isn't starting wrong," she said. "It's being too proud to correct it." He was quiet for a moment. "I believed it," he said, simply. "I know." She paused. "That's what I wanted to tell you. That I know." "No." He held her gaze. "You've changed me," he said. And then before she could respond, "I know you're going to tell me it was me all along, and that you just reminded me of what was already there. I know that's what you believe." He paused. "But from where I'm standing, Clara, from where I'm standing, there was no before you, and there was no good ending to the version of my life that didn't include this. So however we want to explain it, however you want to explain it, it was you." She looked at this man, this stubborn, deliberate, completely honest man, and she said, "All right, it was me." He blinked. She had surprised him. She did that sometimes when he expected her to argue. "All right," he repeated. "You're allowed to give me credit," she said. "I worked hard." He laughed. There it was, the real one. The one she had worked for, without knowing she was working for it, from the very beginning. Ezra Cullen came to the ranch one Sunday in October. He came on his own, drove himself, which Aldridge apparently thought was inadvisable, and which Ezra had apparently found easy to dismiss. He was 81, and had survived things that would have stopped most men at 50, and he was not taking instruction about his driving from anyone. He came to see Clara specifically. She had not expected that. She met him on the porch, and he sat in the chair, the one that had become by unspoken agreement the place where important conversations happened on this ranch, and he looked at her with those sharp, clear eyes that age had not touched. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want an honest answer." "All right," she said. "Do you know what you've got with that man?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "Good." Ezra looked at his hands. "Because what you've got is rare. Not the love part that happens to people. But a man who comes all the way back from where Cole was, that doesn't happen unless someone was willing to stand in the gap for a very long time and not move." He looked up. "That's what you did. And I want you to know someone noticed." Clara felt something at the back of her eyes that she managed barely to contain. "He did the work," she said. Yes, Ezra agreed. But you held the light. He paused. There's a difference. Both matter. They sat together for a while after that, not saying much, in the easy way of people who understand each other without needing to prove it. When Cole came to find her later, he saw Ezra and stopped. The two men looked at each other. Then Ezra said, "She'll do," in the tone of a man delivering a verdict he had been taking his time to reach. Cole looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "I know," he said. The hardest conversation came on a Tuesday morning in November when Harrington asked Clara to stay for a second year. She had known it was coming. The original agreement had been 1 academic year through the spring. The cousins had made genuine progress. The ranch had stabilized. There was no official reason by the original terms for her to remain. Harrington made his offer carefully, the way he did everything respectfully, without pressure, with the full understanding that she was a person with her own life and her own choices. She thanked him, and then she went to find Cole. He was at the south fence line. Of course he was. She walked out to him and stood beside him, and they both looked at the land for a moment before she spoke. "Harrington asked me to stay another year," she said. Cole kept his eyes on the fence. "I heard," he said. "What do you think I should do?" He turned to look at her. "I think," he said carefully, "that a second year is the wrong frame." She waited. "I think—" He stopped, looked at his hands briefly. This was him collecting himself, she knew. Reaching for the words that were right, because he would not say the wrong ones on something this important. "I think that if you're asking me, which I understand is different from asking Harrington, then what I want is not a second year." He looked at her. "What I want is every year." She breathed. "Cole, I have nothing practiced to say," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I have not rehearsed this. I don't know the conventional way to do what I'm trying to do right now, and I have made my peace with not knowing it." He held her gaze. "I want you here. Not for a contract, not for a term. I want you here because this is where you belong, and because I am." He paused. "I am better with you here. And the ranch is better. And Ellie and the boys are better. And I am not willing to go back to what this was before because I understand now what I was missing." A beat. "And because I love you," which I should probably have led with. The Texas morning was still and cold around them. Clara looked at this man who had stood at Ezra's door for 45 minutes before knocking, who had driven a fence post into the ground while teaching himself how to be wrong, who had taken one step in a stable and changed the direction of everything. And she understood that the story Harrington had told her in that kitchen in Boston had almost nothing to do with what she had actually found. Harrington had sent her to break the pride of Texas's wildest cowboy. What she had found instead was a man who had already broken himself slowly over years in the service of a life with no room for tenderness, and had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for someone stubborn enough to stay. "Every year," she said. He went very still. "Yes," she said. "Every year." He reached out and took her hand. Both of them standing at the south fence line in the November cold where they had stood so many times before, arguing, reaching, refusing to look away from each other. He held her hand like he had the first time, like something he intended to keep. "I need to tell you something," he said, "that I should have said earlier." "Tell me now," she said. "Everyone who ever came here," he said, "came trying to change what I was, trying to make me into something more manageable. Something easier." He paused. "You were the first person who came and looked at what I actually was, all of it, the worst parts, and decided it was worth staying for." His voice was very steady. "I don't know how to repay that." "You don't," she said. "It wasn't alone." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "It wasn't." And standing at the fence line, under a sky that went on forever, with the land stretched out around them in every direction, Clara Whitmore, who had come to Texas with 2 leather bags and a composure built from 12 years of not being surprised, felt for the first time in her life that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because the story had gone the way anyone planned it, because it had gone the way. Real things go complicated and painful and full of moments where giving up would have been easier. full of silences that had to be broken and walls that had to be walked around, and a man who had to learn slowly, and at great cost, that strength was not the absence of need, but the courage to name it. The greatest love stories are not the ones where everything is easy. They are the ones where two people decide every single day that the other person is worth the difficulty. Cole Maverick had spent 13 years building a life that kept everything out. Clara Whitmore had spent 1 month proving